Hey guys, tonight we're slipping through a hidden doorway in a medieval manor house, past the roaring chaos of the great hall where men still pound tables and boast about tomorrow's hunt, and into a quieter realm entirely. You push open the heavy oak door to the Lady's Solar, and immediately the world transforms. Soft golden light pools across wooden floorboards, scattered with dried herbs, rosemary, meadowsweet, perhaps a little lavender crushed underfoot, releasing its drowsy perfume into the air. Tapestries ripple gently against stone walls in the draft you've just created, their woven scenes of unicorns and noble ladies frozen mid-gesture in thread of gold and silk. The fire in the hearth crackles with applewood, sending up sparks that briefly illuminate faces turned toward you, some curious, some annoyed at the interruption, all framed by white linen wimples and veils that glow almost ethereal in the candlelight. This is where the real power negotiations happen. You realize, not with swords or land charters, but with embroidery needles and carefully measured words. The story may solve mysteries you never had an explanation for, like how medieval women wielded influence in a world that legally treated them as property, or why the domestic sphere was actually the command center of feudal economics. So before you explore the story with me, please take a moment to help me subscribe to the channel, like and share this video, or maybe leave a comment below, but make sure you do it when you really like what I bring to you. Tell me where you're watching from tonight, whether you're tucked into bed in Toronto or walking a night shift in Manila. Maybe share what draws you to these quieter corners of history, the spaces between the battles that textbooks loved so much. Now let's keep the lights as soft as possible, turn on the fan for a gentle sound to help the story feel more emotional, and let's embark on tonight's journey together. You let the door fall shut behind you with a soft thud that seems almost irreverent in this hushed space. 6 or 7 women occupy the room. It's hard to count precisely in the shifting shadows, and their eyes track your movement with the peculiar stillness of does scenting something unfamiliar in their territory. The lady of the manor herself sits closest to the fire, naturally, her chair the only true chair in the room, with its carved armrests and cushion of deep crimson wool. She's perhaps 35, which in 1320s England makes her a survivor, someone who's outlived at least 2 childbirths and probably a bout of the sweating sickness that took her sister last winter. Her hands move in an endless rhythm over a piece of linen stretched across an embroidery frame, pulling, looping, setting tiny seed pearls into what will eventually become a vestment for the parish church. It's November, you remember, which means Advent approaches and there's always ecclesiastical needlework to complete. The other women arrange themselves in a careful geography of status that you're only beginning to decode. The lady's daughter, perhaps 14, perches on a cushioned stool barely 3 feet from her mother, close enough to learn, far enough to demonstrate deference. 2 older women, companions or perhaps widowed relatives, occupy a shared bench with their own handwork. Servants hover at the periphery, one winding yarn into balls with practiced efficiency, another mending what looks like a torn chemise by the last dregs of daylight filtering through the Solar's narrow window. The room itself is smaller than you expected, maybe 15 feet square, with whitewashed walls above the wainscoting, Someone has hung bunches of dried flowers from the ceiling beams. Roses, certainly. And is that Bethany? The medieval mind believed Bethany warded off nightmares and evil spirits, though you suspect its real value lies in making this enclosed space smell less like the midden heap 3 floors below. A single window with actual glass panes, extraordinary luxury, faces south to catch whatever weak November sun England grudgingly provides. Right now, it shows only darkness, and perhaps the faint reflection of candlelight, turning the glass into a dark mirror that doubles the room's inhabitants, like ghosts attending their own gathering. You notice the floor receives particular attention. Fresh rushes have been laid recently, mixed with chamomile and tansy, their scent releasing each time someone shifts position. Historians still argue whether medieval people were truly as filthy as popular imagination suggests, and this room offers quiet testimony to the contrary, at least among those who could afford standards. The rushes will be swept out weekly, you know from household accounts that survive in dusty archives, replaced with fresh greenery that serves as carpet, air freshener, and insect repellent all at once. You're beginning to understand that nothing in this room is accidental, least of all where people sit. The lady's carved chair with its crimson cushion occupies the prime position, close enough to the fire for warmth, angled to catch both hearth light and the glow from the triple-branched candelabra on the side table, positioned so she can see the door without turning her head. It's a throne in everything but name, and you notice how everyone else has arranged themselves in relation to it, like planets orbiting a sun. Her daughter's embroidered stool places the girl in a fascinating position, literally at her mother's feet, but elevated above the floor cushions, close enough to receive murmured instruction, but not so close as to crowd. You watch as the lady leans down occasionally to inspect the girl's stitch work, offering corrections in a voice too low for you to hear. The stool itself is a masterpiece of unnecessary decoration, its wooden legs carved with vine patterns and its top covered in needlework depicting a hunting scene. Ironic, given that women of this class rarely hunted, though they certainly managed the game parks and supervised the venison's transformation into pies. The 2 older women on the shared bench have claimed the second best position, perpendicular to the fire, so they catch warmth on their left sides while keeping their right hands in decent light for their work. One is stitching what looks like a shirt, practical mending, not decorative work, while the other does something intricate with tablet weaving, creating a narrow band of geometric patterns in red and gold thread. Their bench has a back to it, you notice, which separates it from the backless stools the servants use. In a world before ergonomic furniture, a backrest signals status as clearly as a coat of arms. Historians still argue whether medieval people consciously understood the semiotics of their spatial arrangements, or whether these hierarchies were so deeply internalized they became invisible. You're watching evidence of the latter. No one has announced where anyone should sit, yet everyone knows. The lady's companion, a widow of perhaps 40, whose husband died in some minor border skirmish, occupies a low-backed chair, positioned slightly behind, and to the right of the lady's seat. It's close enough to demonstrate favor and trust, angled away enough to show deference. She's doing accounts, you realize, squinting at a wax tablet and occasionally making marks with a stylus, her lips moving silently as she calculates. 3 servants cluster near the door and the darker edges of the room, their seating demonstrating the final tier of this carefully calibrated system. One sits on a simple 3-legged stool that rocks slightly on the uneven floorboards, carding wool, pulling the cleaned fleece through paired wooden paddles studded with metal teeth to align the fibers. The soft scritch, scritch, scritch of her work provides a gentle rhythm beneath the conversation. Another servant, the one you now know as Beatrice, perches on a floor cushion that's seen better days, its embroidered cover faded and split along one seam. She's mending stockings, working by the light that spills leftover from the candles serving her betters. The third servant stands, near a small side table, arranging items you can't quite make out in the dimness. Standing is exhausting, but it also allows her to respond immediately to any request, to move quickly if the lady needs wine, or the fire wants tending, or someone drops a needle and can't find it in the rushes. You suspect she'll stand for another hour at least, until the lady dismisses the room for the night and your own legs ache in sympathy. What fascinates you is how the seating arrangement allows for multiple simultaneous conversations without chaos. The lady and her daughter exist in their own quiet dialogue bubble, occasionally expanding to include the widow with the accounts when household business requires discussion. The 2 women on the bench murmur to each other about the quality of the linen thread. Apparently, the merchant in town has been mixing in cotton, which sounds exotic until you realize they consider it an inferior adulterant that weakens the weave. The servants near the door speak hardly at all, though you catch the girl carding wool, humming something under her breath, a tune that might be secular or might be a hymn. It's hard to tell. You shift on your cushion, trying to find a position that doesn't make your hip bones protest against the wooden floor beneath the thin padding, and realize that even your cushion tells a story. It's stuffed with wool, not the scratchy straw that fills the servants' cushions, and covered in a wool fabric dyed a respectable brown. Not luxury, but not poverty. You're being accommodated as a guest of uncertain status, worth providing seating for, but not worth breaking out the silk cushions you can see stacked in the corner, reserved for visiting nobility or the lady's particularly favored relatives. The bench against the far wall holds no occupants at all right now, and you wonder about its purpose until you notice the embroidery hoops and baskets of colored thread organized on the floor beside it. It's a workspace, you realize, claimed during daylight hours when the window above it would flood the bench with southern light. Right now, in evening's darkness, it serves as storage and a visual reminder of tomorrow's labors, waiting patiently to resume. Someone, the widow, you think, stifles a small cough, and the lady glances up immediately, concern flickering across her face. The draft from that window is wicked tonight, Eleanor. Move your chair closer to the fire. It's phrased as suggestion, but Eleanor immediately rises and adjusts her position, the lady's daughter jumping up to help shift the heavy chair across the floorboards, with a scraping sound that makes everyone wince. The rearrangement cascades through the room. Now Beatrice has to move her stool slightly to accommodate the chair's new angle, and one of the women on the bench shifts to make more room, and suddenly the entire constellation has reconfigured itself around the lady's central sun. You notice that the lady herself never moves. She is the fixed point. Everyone else orbits, adjusts, accommodates. It's a masterclass in authority, exercised so gently it barely registers as command, yet the power dynamics are absolutely clear. She didn't rise to help move the chair. She didn't need to. Her concern for Eleanor's comfort is genuine. You can see it in her face, but it's expressed through the labor of subordinates, maintaining the invisible but utterly essential boundaries that keep this social system functioning. The lady's daughter resumes her seat on the embroidered stool, and you catch her adjusting her skirts with practiced elegance, ensuring the expensive dyed wool drapes just so. She's learning more than embroidery stitches tonight, you realize. She's learning how to command a room through stillness, how to care for dependence while maintaining hierarchy, how to make a cushion or a chair or a floor. Rush speak volumes about power and favor and the intricate dance of medieval domestic politics. A particularly cold draft snakes through the room, probably from the gap under the door, and you watch as it makes the candle flames bow and shiver, sending shadows leaping across the tapestried walls like dark birds startled into flight. For just a moment, everyone looks slightly sinister, slightly otherworldly. These women in their pale linen wimples transformed into medieval ghosts, haunting their own lives. Then the flames steady, and they're ordinary again, hands busy, voices low, each person held in their proper place by invisible threads, as strong as the silk and gold they work with such patience. The rhythm of needles through fabric creates its own kind of music, a soft punctuation to the conversations that drift and eddy around the solar like smoke from the fire. You lean forward slightly, trying to see what exactly the lady is working on, and she notices your interest. "Altar cloth for Easter," she says, without looking up, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone who's explained this 3 times already to 3 different visitors. The priest requested something suitable for the high holy days, and one cannot very well refuse the church's needs, except you're learning to hear what isn't said. The way she emphasizes requested suggests the priest did considerably more than request, probably demanded, possibly wheedled, certainly applied the kind of spiritual pressure that makes refusing feel like courting damnation. And yet here she is, spending her November evening setting seed pearls into linen that will grace an altar she'll kneel before, transforming obligation into art through sheer patient skill. Each pearl requires perhaps 30 seconds to attach properly, and you count at least 200 already in place, with empty stretches of drawn thread work still awaiting their luminous cargo. Her daughter, meanwhile, is learning a more basic version of the same skills. Her sampler shows rows of different stitches, each labeled in tiny letters that demonstrate she's literate, at least in Latin. You can make out punto scritto above a line of cross stitches, punto riccio marking some kind of knotted technique. It's essentially a reference library she's creating for herself, a catalog of techniques she'll draw on for the rest of her life, as she embroiders household linens ecclesiastical vestments, and perhaps someday the swaddling clothes for her own children. The conversation has shifted from wool quality to something more interesting: marriages, specifically the disastrous union between the baker's daughter in the village and the blacksmith's son that everyone apparently saw coming except the participants. 3 months wed, and already he's spending his evenings at the alehouse instead of his own hearth, one of the bench women says with a disapproving click of her tongue. She's discovered he gambles, and badly. Her father should have inquired more thoroughly, the widow Eleanor observes, not looking up from her accounts. A man's habits before marriage rarely improve after vows are spoken, usually the reverse. The lady makes a small sound that might be agreement or might be diplomatic neutrality. You can't quite tell, but her daughter's eyes flicker up from her sampler with the unmistakable interest of someone filing away information for future use. She's perhaps 2 years from her own betrothal, you estimate, and every story about marriage serves as both warning and instruction manual for navigating the most consequential negotiation of her life. At least the baker has trade enough to support them both if the smithing fails, the lady says finally, threading what you recognize as diplomatic optimism through the conversation. And I'm told the girl has a good hand with bread. Skills matter as much as affection in the long years. It's a perfectly calibrated response, sympathetic to the struggling couple without criticizing the father's judgment, practical without being cynical, offering hope without promising miracles. You're watching statecraft in miniature. The way this woman maintains relationships throughout her husband's holdings, through carefully measured words about other people's troubles. Tomorrow, when she sends a servant to the village with surplus apples from the manor's stores, she'll probably include a few extra for the baker's household. Not charity, exactly. More like investment in goodwill and the intricate web of obligation that keeps a medieval manor functioning. The needlework continues its steady progress. You notice how the sound changes subtly depending on what fabric someone works. The lady's linen whispers as thread slides through its tight weave, while one of the servants is hemming something woolen that gives a softer, almost fuzzy resistance to the needle. It creates an accidental symphony. All these different textures and techniques producing their own acoustic signatures. Historians still argue whether medieval women used their needlework sessions as cover for political organizing, or whether that grants them too much credit for conscious resistance to male authority. You're watching something more nuanced than either interpretation, women exercising what power they have within the constraints they're given, which sometimes looks like submission and sometimes looks like strategy and is often both simultaneously. The conversation shifts again, this time to the approaching Advent season and what preparations need finishing. The lady ticks off items on her fingers without pausing her pearl setting. Candles to be made, additional alms for the poor who will gather at the manor gates, decisions about which servants can be spared to attend extra masses. Her daughter volunteers that she's finished embroidering the covers for the cushions in the chapel and receives a warm smile of approval that makes the girl practically glow. Your stitches are much improved, the lady says, and you catch the daughter sitting straighter, hands steadier on her own work. Praise is currency here, dispensed carefully, and received like benediction. One of the women on the bench asks about the lady's sister, who's apparently cloistered in a convent near York. The question is casual, but you sense genuine concern underneath. Medieval convents were dumping grounds for unmarriageable daughters and refuge for widows in equal measure, and the conditions varied wildly from luxurious to lethal, depending on the house's endowment. She writes that the new abbess is proving sensible. The lady replies, her tone suggesting sensible is high praise. The roof repairs are finally underway before winter worsens, and she's managed to negotiate better terms with the baker in town for their bread. So the sister is thriving, managing her own small economy within convent walls, deploying the same skills of household management and careful negotiation that her sister uses here. You realize that needlework in this room isn't just creating physical objects, it's creating space for exactly these kinds of information exchanges, status updates on the extended network of female relatives and dependents scattered across the landscape in manor houses, convents, and urban households. Beatrice rises to trim one of the candles that started smoking, its wick having formed a mushrooming cap of carbon. She uses a small pair of scissors kept specifically for this purpose, catching the trimmed portion in her hand to avoid dropping hot ash on anyone below. It's a small skilled task, and she performs it with the unconscious competence that speaks to having done it 500 times before. The lady notices something in her daughter's work and leans closer. See here, you've pulled this thread too tight, and it's puckering the fabric. You must maintain even tension, always. Unpick these last 6 stitches and redo them. The girl's face shows a flash of frustration quickly suppressed. She reaches for the small knife used to carefully cut out mistakes, beginning the tedious work of removing her last 10 minutes of progress. You've just witnessed another lesson, though not the one about embroidery tension. You've seen how elite women are trained in the kind of perfectionism that will later be applied to managing households, planning feasts, maintaining estate accounts, and 100 other tasks where good enough isn't acceptable. The daughter's practice sampler is really a practice life, teaching her that precision matters, that mistakes must be corrected rather than covered up, that the standards she sets for herself will eventually become the standards she enforces on dozens of subordinates. The wool carder near the door has finished her current batch and begins loading the cleaned, aligned fibers into a basket, her day's work complete. But she doesn't leave. Instead, she picks up a spindle and begins the next stage, twisting the carded wool into yarn with practiced flicks of her wrist. The spindle becomes a blur of motion, the growing yarn winding around it in precise, even layers. She could do this in her sleep, probably has done it half asleep during early morning shifts. Her hands know the work so well, her mind is free to wander. And you catch her lips moving silently, prayer, maybe, or mental accounting of her own household's needs. The fire pops loudly, sending up a small constellation of sparks, and everyone glances up briefly before returning to their work. Outside, the wind has picked up. You can hear it testing the window's lead cames, whistling through gaps in the stone. November in England is asserting itself, reminding everyone that winter approaches with its long dark months of cold and confinement. These evening gatherings in the solar will become even more important then, one of the few sources of warmth and light and human company, when snow seals the manor off from the world beyond its gates. The standing servant you noticed earlier finally moves with purpose, lifting a pewter flagon from the side table and approaching the lady's chair with a careful, practiced gait that doesn't slosh the liquid inside. "Wine, my lady?" she asks, her voice so soft it barely rises above the fire's crackle. The lady nods without looking up from her pearl setting, and you watch as the servant pours a measure into a wooden cup, not filling it, you notice, perhaps halfway, leaving room so it won't spill when the lady reaches for it with occupied hands. But this isn't the sour ale that servants drink, or even the basic table wine that flows freely in the hall below. You catch the scent as the servant moves past your cushion. Sweet, spiced, warm. Hippocras, the medieval luxury beverage that transforms ordinary wine into something approaching medicinal magic through the addition of honey, cinnamon, ginger, grains of paradise, and whatever other expensive imports a household can afford. The recipe varies wildly depending on wealth and access to trade routes, but the principle remains constant. Take something good and make it better through the careful application of spices worth more per ounce than the cup that holds them. "Would anyone else care for refreshment?" the lady asks, and it's phrased as a question, but functions as permission. Suddenly, everyone is accepting, wooden cups appearing in hands with remarkable speed. The servant makes her rounds, pouring for the daughter, for Eleanor the widow, for the two women on the bench. She hesitates before the servants near the door, glancing back at the lady for confirmation, and receives a small nod. Even Beatrice gets a half measure, though her cup is smaller and made of turned wood, rather than the carved pieces the higher status women use. You accept your own cup when it's offered and take a cautious sip. The wine hits your tongue sweet and almost syrupy, the honey mixing with spice in a combination that tastes like Christmas, and medicine and luxury all at once. It's stronger than you expected. The alcohol content hasn't been diluted much by the additions, and you can feel warmth spreading from your throat down into your chest. This is designed to heat from within, to make the solar's persistent chill more bearable, to loosen tongues and smooth the edges off the day's accumulated tensions. The effect is almost immediate. The conversation that had been meandering in safe, predictable channels suddenly finds new energy. Eleanor sets down her wax tablet and stylus, apparently deciding accounts can wait, and launches into a story about the traveling spice merchant who passed through last month. He claimed the cinnamon came directly from the Holy Land, she says with evident skepticism, as if we couldn't tell Venetian trade goods from genuine Eastern imports. "But your lord husband purchased it anyway, my lady, said it would be churlish to refuse given how far the man had traveled." The lady smiles slightly. "My husband is generous with merchants and stingy with compliments, a useful combination for keeping trade routes open and prices reasonable." There's affection in her voice, but also assessment. She knows exactly why her husband behaves as he does, knows the economic and social calculations behind each seemingly spontaneous act of generosity. You're reminded that medieval marriages among the nobility were business partnerships first, and love matches maybe, possibly if you were extraordinarily lucky. The servant appears again, this time bearing a wooden platter piled with wafers, thin, crisp, round biscuits stamped with a decorative pattern that catches the firelight. They're made from fine wheat flour. You know from reading household accounts in dusty archives centuries from now, mixed with eggs and just enough honey to help them crisp properly when baked in the wafer irons. Not the coarse bread that forms the basis of most medieval diets, but refined luxury carbohydrates designed to complement the spiced wine without filling anyone's stomach uncomfortably. The lady takes one and nibbles it with the delicate precision she applies to everything, letting small bites dissolve on her tongue rather than crunching through it like a hungry farmer. Her daughter mirrors the behavior exactly, learning through imitation how elite women eat in semi-public settings, slowly, carefully, making even something as simple as a wafer look like an art form. The women on the bench are less precious about it, taking larger bites, but still nothing that could be called hearty eating. The servants near the door consume their wafers quickly, efficiently, like people accustomed to eating when opportunity presents, rather than when appetite demands. You take your own wafer and discover it's flavored with something. Anise, maybe, giving it a subtle licorice note that pairs unexpectedly well with the spiced wine. The combination creates a warming glow that settles into your bones, making the solar feel less like a cold stone room and more like a haven against the November darkness pressing against that expensive glass window. Historians still argue whether Hippocras was primarily medicinal or recreational. It shows up in medical texts as treatment for everything from melancholy to digestive complaints, but it also features in descriptions of celebrations and feasts. You're watching evidence that it's both, serving simultaneously as liquid comfort against winter's approach and social lubricant that transforms a working session into something approaching a party, though a very restrained, very female version of festivity. The laughter comes more easily now. Someone tells a story about a chicken that escaped the coop and somehow ended up in the chapel during morning prayers, causing havoc among the devout who couldn't decide whether to capture it or ignore it and preserve their holy concentration. The lady laughs openly, not the measured smile she's shown until now, but genuine amusement that transforms her face from authoritative to young, reminding you she's probably not yet 40, despite the weight of responsibility she carries. Her daughter seizes the moment of levity to ask about the Christmas festivities, what entertainments might be planned, whether there will be musicians beyond the usual estate performers. The lady sobers slightly, but her voice remains warm. Your father is considering hiring tumblers from York if the expense can be justified. And your uncle has written that he'll bring his new hounds for the hunt, so there will certainly be spectacle, if not music. You catch the subtle negotiation embedded in that answer. The daughter wants music and courtly entertainment. The father is weighing costs. The lady is mediating between those positions while also managing expectations. Medieval Christmas wasn't the quiet family holiday of later centuries, but a weeks-long celebration that demonstrated a lord's wealth and generosity to everyone who depended on him. Planning it required the kind of diplomatic and economic skills the lady deploys daily, and her daughter is learning by watching exactly how desires get balanced against budgets. The wine continues its gentle work. Eleanor confesses that she is struggling with the accounts for the dairy, that the numbers seem wrong, but she can't locate the error. Cheese doesn't simply vanish, she says with frustration. Yet according to these figures, we should have 17 more wheels than currently sit in the storehouse. Mice, suggests one of the benchwomen, and Eleanor shakes her head. Not unless the mice have learned to carry off 40-pound wheels of aged cheddar and leave no trace. I suspect someone's been helping themselves, but proving it is another matter entirely. The lady considers this, taking another small sip of Hippocras. Speak with the dairymaid tomorrow, but privately. Accusations in public led to defensiveness and lies. Private conversations sometimes lead to confessions, especially if you offer understanding alongside consequences. More statecraft, more lessons in managing humans, rather than simply managing resources. The daughter is listening intently, filing away this wisdom alongside the embroidery techniques and the proper way to eat a wafer. Beatrice has moved to tend the fire again, adding another log with careful placement that speaks to training. The flames leap up gratefully, sending fresh warmth and fresh light washing across the solar. For a moment, everyone looks almost supernatural in the golden glow. These women in their layered wool and linen, cups of spiced wine in their hands, needlework temporarily abandoned in favor of this brief interlude of warmth and gentle intoxication and companionship. You realize the Hippocras and wafers serve another function beyond pleasure. They mark transition points in the evening, breaking the solar's activities into before and after, work and rest, formality and ease. The rhythm of the night follows a pattern these women know instinctively. First the settling in, the arrangement of bodies and tools, then the serious work while light and energy last. Then refreshment to mark the shift toward lighter tasks and easier conversation, then eventually the gradual winding down toward bed. Its choreography performed nightly, varied slightly depending on the season and who's present, but fundamentally constant as the turning of the year. The wine level in the flagon drops steadily as the servant makes another round, topping off cups that have emptied. No one is drunk. That would violate every code of proper female behavior. But everyone is softer around the edges, more willing to laugh, less guarded in their speech. The solar has transformed from workspace into something approaching sanctuary, and the spiced wine is both cause and symbol of that transformation. The lady's daughter sets down her sampler with visible relief, even with Hippocras warming her veins. Unpicking and redoing stitches holds limited appeal, and reaches instead for something you hadn't noticed, tucked beside her stool. A lute emerges into the firelight, its pear-shaped body gleaming with the patina of regular handling, its strings catching light like spider silk strung with dew. She cradles it with the easy familiarity of someone who's held this instrument since childhood, her fingers finding the frets without needing to look. "Will you play for us, Margaret?" the lady asks, though the question is pure formality. The girl is already tuning, plucking individual strings, and adjusting the wooden pegs with tiny precise turns. The instrument emits soft discordant notes that gradually resolve into harmony, and you're struck by how this random tuning process creates its own kind of music, promise and anticipation wrapped in sound. Margaret, so that's the daughter's name, begins with something you don't recognize. A melody that moves in modal scales, unfamiliar to ears, trained on later centuries' major and minor keys. It sounds ancient, even though it's probably contemporary. One of those courtly pieces that circulate among noble households in handwritten manuscripts and oral tradition. Her technique isn't flawless. You catch a buzzed note where her finger didn't press quite hard enough, a slight hesitation in a passage that apparently challenges her, but there's genuine feeling in her playing, a quality that transcends technical perfection. The room responds to the music like flowers turning towards sun. The servants stop their work entirely, hands stilling in mid-stitch or mid-card, forbidden the luxury of not working during daylight hours, but apparently granted this small permission when evening and music combine. Eleanor leans back in her chair and closes her eyes, her lined face relaxing into something approaching peace. The two bench women sway slightly, unconsciously, their bodies finding the rhythm. You realize this is what the solar sounds like without men. No booming bass voices, no stamping of feet to drinking songs, no competitive bellowing of ballads designed to demonstrate lung capacity and alcohol tolerance. Instead, you get this, a single young woman's tentative virtuosity on an instrument associated with private chambers and intimate gatherings, playing music that values subtlety over volume, emotion over display. Margaret finishes the piece and immediately begins another, this one faster, with a dancing quality that makes you think of spring festivals, even though November rain now drums against the window. Her confidence grows as she plays, her earlier hesitations vanishing into muscle memory and the kind of unself-conscious absorption that comes from loving what you're doing. She's showing off a little now, attempting ornaments and quick runs between chords, mostly succeeding and occasionally not. But the failures don't matter because the joy is so evident. Then something remarkable happens. Eleanor begins to sing. Her voice enters on a held note that seems to come from somewhere deep in her chest, a rich alto that fills the solar stone, confines with unexpected power. She's singing words in French, proper courtly French, not the Anglo-Norman dialect that English nobility mangle, and the text is something about a lady waiting for her knight to return from distant wars. It's achingly beautiful and achingly sad, and you remember that Eleanor is a widow whose husband died in exactly those circumstances, killed in some Scottish border dispute that accomplished nothing except creating more widows and orphans. The lady joins on the second verse, her voice a soprano that weaves around Eleanor's alto like embroidery thread through linen. Their voices blend with the ease of long practice. These women have done this before, many times, creating harmonies in this very room on other November evenings when the men were occupied elsewhere and music offered brief escape from needlework's tedium. Margaret adjusts her playing to support the voices, simplifying her ornamentation to provide steady harmonic foundation rather than competing for attention. She's learning another skill here, how to accompany rather than perform, how to make other people's art sound better, even if it means subordinating your own virtuosity. It's training for a life spent making others look good, making men look competent, and children look accomplished, and households look well managed through invisible labor that never quite receives credit. One of the bench women adds a third voice, a harmony that slots in above the lady's soprano with the certainty of someone who knows exactly where she belongs in the musical texture. Now they're creating polyphony, three-part counterpoint that Renaissance theorists won't even properly codify for another century, but which medieval musicians navigate through intuition and practice. Historians still argue whether women's musical education was primarily recreational or whether it served broader cultural purposes, but you're hearing evidence that it created spaces for female artistry and cooperation that had no equivalent in male spheres. The song builds through several verses, each one adding subtle variations. Eleanor ornaments a line here. The lady holds a note longer there. Margaret introduces a new rhythmic pattern in the lute. It's collaborative improvisation, each woman bringing her own interpretation while listening carefully to ensure she doesn't overwhelm the others. The result is something no single performer could create alone, a tapestry of sound as intricate as the embroidery abandoned on their laps. They end together on a sustained chord that gradually fades, the lute's final strum hanging in the air like incense smoke before dissipating into the room's ambient sounds, fire, wind, breathing. For a moment, no one speaks. The spell is too fragile to risk breaking with words. Then, Beatrice, young, presumably untrained in courtly music, begins humming. It's not the French courtly song, but something older, simpler, probably English, or even earlier. A folk melody that her mother taught her, that her mother's mother taught her mother, stretching back through generations of women who sang while they worked and worked while they sang. The melody is almost pentatonic, built on a scale that predates the church's modal system, and it has the kind of inevitable rightness that suggests it grew organically from the landscape itself, rather than being composed by anyone in particular. Margaret picks up the melody on her lute after a few measures, finding the notes by ear and adding the simplest possible accompaniment. She's grinning now. The courtly mask has completely dissolved in the pleasure of making music, of discovering that folk tunes and expensive instruments can coexist, that the solo can hold both French sophistication and English earthiness without contradiction. The lady doesn't sing this time, but she's smiling, and you catch her fingers tapping rhythm against her chair's armrest. Her daughter isn't the only one taking pleasure in this moment. Everyone in the room has softened, opened, become more themselves and less their social roles. The Hippocras helped, certainly, but the music completes the transformation, creating temporary democracy where hierarchy usually rules, absolutely. Another voice joins, the wool carder, her spinning forgotten, as she adds harmony to Beatrice's melody. She doesn't know music theory, probably can't read the neumes and squares of medieval notation, but she knows instinctively how to find the third or the fifth, how to weave her voice through the melody without overpowering it. You're watching oral tradition in action, musical knowledge transmitted through listening and imitation rather than written instruction, and it's no less sophisticated for being unwritten. The lute continues its gentle accompaniment, Margaret's fingers moving across frets and strings with increasing confidence. She's transposing on the fly, modulating to accommodate the voice's range, demonstrating musical intelligence that no amount of theoretical study could teach. This is practical knowledge, earned through hundreds of evenings exactly like this one, playing for women who sing because singing makes work bearable and evenings pass more sweetly. They cycle through several verses of the folk tune before it naturally winds down, the voices dropping away one by one until only Beatrice remains, humming the final phrase to its conclusion. Then silence again, but a different quality of silence. Satisfied, complete, like the moment after a good meal, when hunger has been fed and contentment settles in. Your mother would be proud of your voice, the lady tells Beatrice, and the servant girl flushes with pleasure, ducking her head in a gesture that's equal parts gratitude and embarrassment. It's a small kindness, costing nothing, but you watch how it straightens Beatrice's spine, how it feeds something in her that's been hungry. Margaret sets the lute carefully aside and reclaims her sampler, but her expression has changed. The frustration from earlier has evaporated, replaced by the kind of quiet satisfaction that comes from doing something well and having it witnessed. She returns to her unpicking and restitching with renewed patience, as if music has somehow made needlework bearable again. The music fades into memory, leaving behind a peculiar intimacy that makes what comes next feel almost inevitable. Eleanor shifts in her chair, settles her skirts with deliberate fussiness, and says with the careful casualness of someone who's been waiting for the right moment, "My lady, I must speak plainly about the new steward your husband has appointed." The temperature in the room doesn't actually drop, but you feel the shift nonetheless. Everyone's attention focuses on Eleanor without anyone appearing to look directly at her. It's a trick you're learning, how medieval women can seem absorbed in their needlework while actually tracking every word, every facial expression, every subtle signal that might indicate how dangerous or delicious this conversation is about to become. The lady doesn't look up from her pearl setting. "Speak plainly then. That's what I value you for, Eleanor." Her voice is neutral, but you catch the faint emphasis on plainly, a reminder that whatever Eleanor says next should be factual, rather than merely gossip, though the line between those categories is often conveniently blurry. "He's competent enough with the grain accounts," Eleanor begins. "I'll grant him that much. But he's been dismissive of the dairymaid when she reports problems, and yesterday he told the head cook that the kitchen staff should manage with less firewood because we're wasteful." His exact word, wasteful, as if keeping the bread ovens hot enough to feed 40 people daily is some kind of luxury. One of the bench women makes a small sound of disgust. Men who've never managed a household always think they can do it better than those who actually do the work. My late husband's cousin was exactly the same. Thought running a manor meant sitting in an office adding numbers. Never mind that numbers mean nothing if the bread doesn't rise because the ovens weren't stoked properly. The lady sets down her needle with deliberate care, finally looking up. "Has he interfered with your authority, Eleanor, or merely offended your sensibilities?" It's a crucial distinction, and you're watching how skillfully she dissects the complaint, separating genuine operational problems from personality conflicts that, while annoying, don't actually threaten the household's function. Eleanor considers this, her fingers still on her own needlework. "Both, if I'm honest. He questions my decisions about household expenditures in front of the lower servants, which undermines my ability to manage them effectively. But also, and I admit this may be my pride talking, he acts as though women's work is somehow less important than men's work, as though managing the livestock matters more than managing the people who tend the livestock. All stewards act that way. The widow on the bench observes dryly. They answer to your husband, not to you, my lady, and so they think the male sphere of concern is paramount. They forget that a well-run kitchen and dairy and laundry make everything else possible. You're fascinated by the delicacy of this conversation. Eleanor can't directly criticize the lady's husband for his choice of steward. That would be disloyal, possibly dangerous depending on the husband's temperament. But she can complain about the steward himself, and she can trust the lady to understand the implicit criticism, and perhaps, if she agrees, to exert her own influence to modify the situation. It's politics by indirection. Power exercised through suggestion rather than command. The lady is quiet for a long moment, her fingers resuming their work on the altar cloth almost absently. When she speaks, her voice is measured, thoughtful. My husband values efficiency and good accounting. Those are the metrics by which he judges the steward's performance. If we wish him to value other things, we must find ways to make those things visible and measurable. It's a masterclass in strategic thinking. She's not promising to intervene directly. That might set a precedent that undermines her husband's authority and, by extension, her own position as his partner rather than his subordinate. Instead, she's suggesting a campaign, a way to gradually shift perception and evaluation criteria so that the steward's limitations become apparent through his own failures rather than through women's complaints. Margaret has stopped even pretending to work on her sampler, listening with the intense concentration of someone learning statecraft disguised as household management. Her mother catches the look and offers a slight smile. You're learning why embroidery is useful, daughter. It gives our hands something to do while our minds work on more complex problems. One of the servants, the one who's been mending stockings, ventures her own complaint, emboldened by the direction of conversation. Begging your pardon, my lady, but the new steward also reduced the servants' ale rations, saying we were drinking more than we should. But it's the same amount we've always received, and we work just as hard. The lady's expression tightens almost imperceptibly. That decision was made without consulting me then. The servant's provisions are my domain, not his. There's steel under the velvet now, a hint of genuine anger at this encroachment on her authority. Medieval marriages required constant negotiation of boundaries, and stewards appointed by husbands could easily become flashpoints if they didn't respect the invisible lines dividing male and female spheres of control. Historians still argue whether medieval women had real power or merely the appearance of power within carefully circumscribed domestic domains. You're watching evidence that the distinction is meaningless. The domestic domain encompasses feeding, clothing, and maintaining everyone in the household, from the lord himself down to the lowest scullery maid. Control that domain, and you control everything that makes the estate function, regardless of whether legal documents and property deeds acknowledge your authority. I'll speak with my husband, the lady says finally, and the phrasing is perfect. Not "I'll speak with the steward," which would be confrontational and possibly ineffective, but "I'll speak with my husband," which positions her as partner rather than subordinate, someone who brings important information to her husband's attention rather than complaining about his decisions. The room relaxes fractionally. Eleanor inclines her head in acknowledgement. The servant who spoke up looks simultaneously relieved and terrified. She's gambled by speaking at all, and while the outcome appears positive, there's always risk when lower status people voice complaints about their betters. But the floodgates have opened now, and other grievances begin to surface, carefully phrased, never quite accusatory, but nevertheless clear. The cook is demanding ingredients the kitchen budget can't support. The laundress insists she needs additional help, but the steward refuses to hire another girl. The groom has been complaining that the stable boys are lazy, which everyone knows is nonsense because those boys work from before dawn until after dark. Each complaint receives the lady's measured attention. She asks clarifying questions, probes for details, occasionally offers solutions, but more often simply acknowledges the problem and promises to consider how best to address it. You're watching her perform emotional labor, the work of listening, validating, managing not just resources, but the feelings and morale of everyone who depends on her. And threading through it all is the unspoken understanding that complaining about men is one of the few safe ways for medieval women to bond across class lines. The lady and Eleanor and the servants can be equals. The social structure won't permit it, but they can be allies in the eternal project of making men's decisions workable, despite men's tendency to make those decisions without understanding their practical implications. "My husband means well," the lady says at one point, and it's both defense and apology. But he sees the estate from his perspective, which is necessarily different from ours. Our task is to help him see what he misses, to translate between his world and ours. It's a generous interpretation of what might simply be masculine disregard for domestic details, but it's also politically astute, framing the problem as communication failure rather than malice or incompetence leaves room for solutions that don't require admitting anyone was wrong. Margaret speaks up, surprising everyone, including probably herself. "When I marry, I shall make certain my husband understands that I'm to be consulted on all household matters before decisions are made." Her voice carries the absolute conviction of use, the belief that she'll somehow negotiate a better arrangement than centuries of women before her managed. The lady doesn't contradict her daughter, but her smile is tinged with sadness and wisdom. "That is an excellent goal, Margaret. Hold to it as long as circumstances permit." The unspoken message is clear. Noble marriages are arranged for political and economic reasons, and the bride's preferences about household management authority are rarely part of the negotiation. Margaret will be lucky if her husband is merely indifferent rather than actively obstructive. The conversation winds down gradually, each woman having aired her particular frustrations and received the solidarity of being heard. Tomorrow, the steward will still be dismissive, and the cook will still demand impossible ingredients, and the groom will still complain about the stable boys. But tonight, in this room, these women have reminded themselves and each other that they are not alone in their struggles, that the work they do matters even when it's invisible to the men who think they run everything. The mood has shifted after all that complaining, taken on a weight that threatens to drag the evening toward melancholy, and the lady seems to recognize this. She sets down her altar cloth with a finality that draws everyone's attention and announces, "Eleanor, fetch the letters that arrived this afternoon. I think we could all benefit from news of the wider world beyond our steward's inadequacies." Eleanor rises with visible relief. Apparently, she's as tired of the complaining as anyone, despite having initiated it, and crosses to a small wooden chest tucked against the wall. She returns with 3 folded pieces of parchment, each sealed with colored wax that's already been broken, and hands them to the lady with a slight curtsy that seems automatic rather than considered. The lady examines the first letter, holding it close to the candelabra to catch maximum light. Her lips move slightly as she reads, and you're reminded that literacy among noble women, while not universal, is common enough that this small miracle of reading hardly registers as remarkable to anyone in the room. "My sister writes from York," she announces, and several heads lift with interest. The cloistered sister, you remember, the one managing convent finances and roof repairs. She says the new abbess has proven more competent than expected. Apparently, the woman has connections to wool merchants in Flanders and has negotiated contracts that will keep the convent solvent through next year at least. They are producing altar cloths and vestments for export. The lady pauses, a smile playing at her lips. She also mentions that one of the younger nuns was discovered keeping a pet squirrel in her cell, which caused considerable excitement when it escaped during Vespers and disrupted the entire service. Laughter rippled through the solar, genuine amusement at the image of nuns chasing a panicked squirrel through their devotions, but also relief at the shift in tone. Margaret actually giggles, a sound that transforms her from dignified young noblewoman back into the child she was not long ago. "Does your sister sound content?" Eleanor asks, and there's real concern in the question. Women sent to convents don't always choose that path willingly, and unhappiness in religious life can manifest in ways both subtle and devastating. The lady considers this, her eyes scanning the letter again. She sounds purposeful, engaged. She writes about the business affairs with genuine interest, and she mentions looking forward to Advent preparations. I think she's found her place, which is more than many of us can say. That last phrase carries unexpected weight. The lady herself is positioned exactly where social convention demands, but you wonder if she ever contemplates alternative lives, roads not taken, different versions of herself that might have existed under other circumstances. She sets the first letter aside and picks up the second. "This one is from my cousin in London. You remember Catherine, Eleanor? She married that wool factor 3 years ago." Eleanor nods, and the lady continues reading silently for a moment before summarizing aloud. She's with child again, hopes this one survives past infancy, unlike the previous 2. She asks for prayers. The mood darkens immediately. Infant mortality is the shadow that haunts every medieval woman's life, the constant threat that makes joy in pregnancy always conditional, always tempered by the knowledge that birth is dangerous and the first year of life more dangerous still. You watch Margaret's hand move unconsciously to her belly, a gesture that speaks to fear she's already learned despite her youth. We shall pray for her daily, the lady says firmly, as if determination alone can protect a woman hundreds of miles away from the thousand things that can go wrong during pregnancy and childbirth. Eleanor, make a note to send her some of the dried raspberry leaf from our still room. It's said to strengthen the womb. Whether raspberry leaf actually helps is debatable, but the gesture matters. The tangible evidence that women scattered across England maintain networks of support and knowledge sharing, passing remedies and advice through letters and messengers, trying to help each other survive what men dismiss as women's troubles. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine was purely superstition or contained genuine therapeutic value, and you're watching evidence that the question is irrelevant to the women involved. What matters is the attempt to help, the refusal to accept suffering as inevitable even when it probably is, the human need to do something when the alternative is helpless waiting. The third letter provokes a different response. The lady reads it through completely before speaking, and when she does, her voice carries layers you can't quite pass. Amusement, exasperation, affection, concern, all mixed together. My brother writes that he's planning to visit for the Christmas season, bringing his entire household, which means we'll need to prepare chambers for at least 15 additional people, plus their servants. Eleanor's face shows pure calculation. She's already mentally inventorying linens, assessing the stores of wine and preserved foods, considering which chambers can be aired out and made presentable on short notice. How long does he plan to stay? She asks, because duration determines everything about the scale of preparation required. He doesn't specify, which means he hasn't decided, which means we should prepare for at least a fortnight. The lady's voice is dry. My brother has never understood that his spontaneity requires other people's labor. One of the benchwomen clucks sympathetically. Men never do. They see only the pleasant results, the feast, the warm chamber, the clean linens, never the days of work that produce those results. But there's also excitement threading through the concern. 15 visitors means disruption and extra labor, certainly, but it also means novelty, fresh faces, news, and stories from wherever the brother has been, potential marriage prospects, if he's bringing age-appropriate sons or nephews, entertainment and music, and the kind of elaborate feasting that breaks the winter's monotony. Margaret looks particularly interested, and you suspect she's calculating whether any of those 15 visitors might include young men worth impressing with her improved embroidery and lute playing. The lady notices her daughter's expression and smiles. Don't set your hopes too high, child. Your uncle's household consists mainly of rough soldiers and aging retainers, though he does mention bringing his new squire, a boy of good family who's learning courtly manners. She lets that hang in the air, watching Margaret try to maintain a neutral expression while obviously desperate to ask more questions. A boy your age, perhaps? Eleanor asks innocently, doing the daughter's work for her. Perhaps 16 or 17, I judge from the description. The lady is clearly enjoying this now, parceling out information in small doses, making Margaret work for each detail. His family holds land in the Welsh Marches, which is promising. They'd be accustomed to managing difficult borders and unpredictable circumstances. useful training for any future husband. There it is, stated plainly, the eternal project of marrying daughters to appropriate men, building alliances through the careful exchange of children who become chess pieces in much larger games of power and property. Margaret has the grace to look simultaneously excited and terrified, which is probably the appropriate response to being reminded that her childhood is ending and her utility as a marriageable commodity is beginning. But before the conversation can turn melancholy again, one of the servants asks, "Will there be mummers, my lady, for the Christmas celebrations with your brother visiting?" Her voice carries such hope that even the lady laughs. "I should think mummers are inevitable, given my brother's taste for spectacle. Probably musicians as well, and knowing him, he'll organize a hunt that requires 3 days of preparation for 2 hours of actual hunting." The affection in her voice is genuine now, unmixed with exasperation. Whatever his faults, the brother is clearly loved, and his impending visit represents a bright spot in the long dark of winter. The letters have accomplished their purpose, lifted the Solar's mood, connected these women to the wider world beyond their manor's walls, reminded them that they're part of networks that stretch across England and into the continent beyond. Medieval women's lives could be intensely isolated, confined to estates they might leave only a handful of times per year. And letters were lifelines that carried news, maintained relationships, and proved that somewhere beyond the familiar walls, life continued in all its chaotic variety. Eleanor gathers the letters and returns them to the chest, handling them with the care due precious objects. Parchment is expensive, news is valuable, and these physical artifacts connecting the lady to her sister, cousin, and brother will be read multiple times. Perhaps, shared with other literate women who visit, definitely treasured as evidence of affection and connection across distance. The conversation splinters now into smaller exchanges, Margaret asking Eleanor about Christmas preparations, the bench women discussing what additional help they'll need from the village to prepare chambers for 15 guests, the servants near the door speculating about whether the visiting household will include anyone interesting or merely more bored soldiers looking for someone to order around. You notice the lady has returned to her pearl setting, but her expression has softened. The letters have reminded her that she's not just a household manager, eternally negotiating with incompetent stewards, but a sister, a cousin, an aunt, a woman embedded in relationships that matter beyond their practical utility. For just a moment, you glimpse the person beneath the social role, someone who loves her chaotic brother, despite his inconvenient spontaneity, who worries for her pregnant cousin, who takes pride in her sister's competent management of convent finances. The fire needs tending again, and Beatrice rises to do it, adding 2 logs this time as the night deepens and the cold intensifies. The flames leap up gratefully, and in their light, you watch these women resume their evening's work. Needles moving, voices murmuring, the Solar wrapping them in its particular magic, where letters from distant places can transform an ordinary November evening into something approaching adventure. The servant who's been standing this entire time, you realize you still haven't learned her name, finally moves with the careful deliberation of someone whose feet hurt, crossing to the shadowed corner where you now notice a small table draped with linen cloth. She lifts the cloth like a magician revealing a trick, and underneath sits an array of objects that catches the candlelight in ways both subtle and spectacular. Sugar sculptures, you realize with a jolt of recognition, the medieval luxury that costs more per ounce than some people earn in a month. I thought we might enjoy some sweetness, the lady says, and there's a note of pride in her voice that wasn't present when discussing altar cloths or household management. The confectioner finished these this afternoon. I wanted to see them before presenting them at the feast when my brother arrives. Everyone leans forward, even the servants, though they catch themselves and try to appear less obviously interested. Sugar in 1320s. England is so rare, so expensive, so associated with wealth and access to Venetian or Genoese trade routes that its presence announces status louder than any heraldic banner. The fact that this household can afford not just sugar, but someone skilled enough to transform it into art speaks volumes about the Lord's financial success and the lady's commitment to displaying that success appropriately. The sculptures are remarkable even by later standards you're familiar with. One depicts a castle complete with tiny crenellated towers, each battlement delicately formed and hardened into translucent amber. Another shows a swan, its neck curved gracefully, its wings spread as if caught mid-flight. A third is purely geometric, an elaborate knot pattern that interweaves strands of sugar into something that looks like frozen honey-colored rope. All three sit on small silver plates that reflect and multiply their beauty. May we touch them? Margaret asks, her voice carrying the wonder of a child confronting magic, which in some sense this is, the transformation of substance through heat and skill into forms nature never intended. Carefully, the lady cautions, and her daughter reaches out with one finger to brush the castle's tower. The sugar is cool and hard, more like glass than food, and Margaret's expression shows pure delight, mixed with something like reverence. The confectioner's art is still emerging in this period, you know from your reading in distant archives. Sugar itself only began arriving in England in meaningful quantities within the last century, brought by crusaders returning from the Holy Land and by Mediterranean merchants willing to risk the dangerous sea routes for the Prophet's luxury goods command. The techniques for working it, boiling to specific temperatures, pulling and shaping before it hardens, creating these sculptures that exist somewhere between food and art, are jealously guarded. Secrets pass from master to apprentice in Italian and Arab workshops. How much did these cost? Eleanor asks bluntly, her account keeper's mind unable to admire beauty without also calculating expense. The lady names a sum that makes even Eleanor's experienced face show shock. It's enough to feed the entire household for a week, possibly more. Several of the servants exchange glances that communicate clearly that money could have bought warmer cloaks, better shoes, the kind of practical necessities that never seem to make it into the budget while sugar castles apparently do. But the lady catches those glances and addresses them directly, which surprises you. I know it seems extravagant, perhaps it is, but my brother brings nobles from court, people who judge us by these displays. If we appear prosperous and sophisticated, we attract favorable attention, which translates to better marriage prospects for Margaret, better positions for our sons, better terms when my husband negotiates wool contracts or land exchanges. Beauty is expensive, but poverty of display is more expensive still. It's a remarkably candid explanation of medieval economics, the way wealth must be performed to attract more wealth, how failing to display prosperity can trap a family in declining status, no matter how much gold sits in their strongbox. Historians still argue whether medieval conspicuous consumption was purely wasteful or served genuine economic and social functions, and you're hearing the argument for functionality laid out with unusual clarity. One of the benchwomen nods slowly. My late husband used to say the same, that the feast we couldn't afford to throw earned us the ally we couldn't afford to lose. Economics for the rich work differently than for the poor. The named servant, you're determined to learn her name, begins carefully lifting the sculptures and bringing them closer to the fire's light, so everyone can examine them more carefully. The castle reveals even more detail up close. Tiny windows suggested by darker patches in the sugar, a portcullis gate created by scoring the surface with something sharp, even minuscule flags on the towers formed from gilded sugar, pulled impossibly thin. Can we eat them? Beatrice asks, and immediately looks mortified at her own boldness. But the lady laughs, not unkindly. Eventually, yes. They're made of sugar and marchpane, almond paste mixed with rose water and honey, then sculpted and hardened. But not tonight. These are for display first, consumption later. After my brother and his guests have admired them sufficiently, we'll break them apart and distribute pieces. Everyone will get a taste. You notice the phrase, everyone will get a taste. Not everyone will receive equal portions, but everyone will participate in the luxury, even if the servants receive fragments while the nobles receive substantial pieces. It's hierarchy made edible, status translated into sugar portions, but it's also a form of inclusion that matters in its own way. Margaret asks how the sculptures are made, and the lady explains what she knows. The precise temperatures required to boil sugar to different stages of hardness, the way it must be worked quickly before it cools and becomes unworkable, the danger of burns from sugar that's hotter than boiling water and clings to skin. One of the benchwomen mentions that she heard of a confectioner in London who lost 3 fingers to sugar burns, and everyone winces in sympathetic horror. The swan sculpture captures particular attention because its wings show individual feather details impossibly delicate, each one formed by pulling tiny strands of sugar and laying them in overlapping patterns. The confectioner spent 2 days on this piece alone, the lady says, and you can hear pride and also acknowledgement of the human labor transformed into this beautiful temporary thing that will eventually be eaten and cease to exist, except in memory. Will you commission sugar sculptures for my wedding feast? Margaret asks, and the question carries such hope, such assumption that she'll have a wedding important enough to merit such expense, that the lady's expression softens into something approaching sadness. If circumstances permit, daughter, yes. If your marriage is important enough to warrant such display, if the family you marry into values these things, if we can afford it when the time comes, then yes, absolutely. So many qualifications, so many uncertainties embedded in what should be a simple promise, and Margaret's face shows she understands the conditional nature of her mother's answer, even if she wishes she didn't. The geometric knot sculpture prompts discussion of symbolism. Does it represent anything specific, or is it purely decorative? One of the bench women suggests it might reference the endless knot patterns found in religious manuscripts, symbolizing eternity, or the interconnectedness of all things. Eleanor thinks it's meant to demonstrate the confectioner's skill at creating difficult forms. The lady admits she doesn't know, that the confectioner created it based on a drawing in a book of Arabic mathematical patterns, and beyond that the meaning is whatever the viewer brings to it. You're struck by how this conversation about sugar sculptures has become a conversation about art, meaning, economics, and status all at once. Nothing in medieval life exists in isolation. Every object carries layers of significance. Every choice about what to display or consume or commission ripples out into social and economic consequences that can affect a family's fortunes for generations. The servant finally covers the sculptures again with the linen cloth. Hiding them from view like treasure, return to a vault. The room feels slightly diminished by their absence, as if they'd been radiating light rather than merely reflecting it. But their presence has accomplished something, reminded everyone that beauty exists, that human skill can transform raw materials into wonder, that even in November's darkness, there are things worth admiring for no practical reason beyond the fact that they're extraordinary. The lady returns to her pearl setting with renewed energy, perhaps inspired by the confectioner's patience with delicate work. Margaret picks up her lute again, playing softly now, creating background music rather than demanding attention. The sola settles back into its working rhythm, but something has shifted. You can feel it in the way shoulders have relaxed, in the slight smiles that linger on faces bent over needlework, in the general sense that the evening has delivered multiple small pleasures and might deliver more before it ends. The door opens without warning, admitting a draft of cold air that makes the candles gutter and everyone look up in mild alarm. A man enters, middle-aged, tonsured, wearing the simple black cassock of a priest, and you recognize him as the household chaplain, here for the evening devotions that structure medieval days as surely as the sun's rising and setting. He carries a small wooden box under one arm and a prayer book bound in worn leather under the other, and his expression suggests this is routine rather than interruption. Father Benedict, the lady greets him, setting down her needlework and rising with the fluid grace of someone who performs this ritual nightly. Everyone else follows her lead, Margaret laying aside her lute carefully, Eleanor marking her place in the accounts, the servants abandoning their tasks to arrange themselves into something approaching formal rows. You scramble up from your cushion, trying not to look clumsy, and find yourself positioned near the back of the gathering. The chaplain moves to the space before the fire, which apparently serves as impromptu chapel when the actual chapel is too cold or too far or simply unnecessary for small household devotions. He sets down his wooden box and opens it to reveal items you recognize: a small silver crucifix, 2 short candles already mounted in portable holders, a vial of what's probably holy water. He arranges these on the small table recently cleared of hippocras and wafers, transforming secular space into sacred with practiced efficiency. Let us begin with the evening prayers. Father Benedict says, his voice carrying the particular timbre of someone accustomed to being heard in much larger spaces. Everyone bows their heads, and you follow suit, watching through lowered lashes as the chaplain begins the Latin prayers that mark the canonical hour of Compline, the final prayer service of the day, designed to commend souls to God's protection through the dangerous darkness of night. The words wash over you in rhythmic waves. De lucis ante terminum, rerum creator, possumus. Before the ending of the light, creator of all things, we pray. The lady and Eleanor join in, their voices confident with the Latin, even if their pronunciation would make classical scholars weep. Margaret mouths the words silently, still learning. The servants stand mute. Literacy in Latin is a luxury reserved for those with education and leisure, and these women's knowledge of prayers comes from hearing rather than reading. But then Father Benedict shifts into English for a prayer specifically crafted for this household, asking God's blessing on the manor, the Lord currently away on business, the lady and her daughter, the servants and livestock, the growing grain and the stored harvest. His English carries the thick local accent that Latin obscures, and suddenly the prayers feel more immediate, more connected to the actual concerns of this actual place, rather than abstract theological concepts. You notice the chaplain's hands as he gestures through the prayers. They're stained with ink, suggesting he serves as scribe as well as spiritual guide, copying documents and keeping records in addition to saying masses and hearing confessions. Medieval priests in noble households wore multiple hats, their education making them valuable for administrative tasks far beyond their religious duties. The prayers conclude, and everyone makes the sign of the cross with practiced synchronization. But Father Benedict doesn't dismiss the gathering. Instead, he reaches into his cassock and produces several small objects that he distributes to the lady, Eleanor, and Margaret. Pomanders, you realize with delight, as their scent reaches you even across the solar's distance. Oranges studded with cloves, probably also containing ambergris or musk if the household can afford it, designed to ward off the miasmas and corrupt airs that medieval medicine blamed for disease. Fresh from the still room, Father Benedict explains, though the lady clearly already knows this. Sister Jones thought they came out particularly well this batch. The cloves are Moluccan, very potent. He's proud of this detail, the exotic origin of the spices speaking to the household's access to global trade networks that most English manors can only dream about. The lady lifts her pomander to her nose and inhales deeply, her eyes closing briefly in pleasure. Tell Sister Joan these are excellent. The scent is strong without being overwhelming. She passes the pomander to Margaret, who sniffs it with equal appreciation before tucking it into the small leather pouch that hangs from her belt. Medieval pockets being non-existent, women carried such pouches for items they wanted close at hand. Historians still argue whether pomanders actually prevented disease or merely made people smell better. But you're watching evidence that the distinction didn't matter to medieval users. The pomanders served multiple purposes. They masked the inevitable odors of life in close quarters with limited bathing. They demonstrated wealth through the expensive spices embedded in them. They offered psychological comfort through the belief that they provided protection, and they simply smelled pleasant in a world that often didn't. Eleanor asks Father Benedict about the parish news, and he settles in for what's clearly a regular part of these evening gatherings, his role as conduit for information about the wider community beyond the manor house walls. Old Thomas the shepherd passed in his sleep 3 nights ago, he reports, his tone mixing sadness with acceptance. A good death, no pain, surrounded by family, with time to confess and receive the sacraments. His son will take over the flock. The lady nods gravely. Send the family a ham from our stores and ask if they need anything for the burial. Thomas served this manor for 40 years. We'll ensure he's buried properly. It's the casual exercise of noblesse oblige, the unwritten contract that binds lord and peasant in mutual obligation. The shepherd worked faithfully. The manor provides in his death. The cycle continues. More news follows. A successful birth in the village, a dispute over property boundaries that Father Benedict helped mediate, rumors that the wool merchants from Flanders might visit the region earlier than usual this year. Each piece of information gets absorbed, evaluated, stored away for future reference. The lady asks clarifying questions. Eleanor makes mental notes about economic implications. Margaret simply listens, with the expression of someone learning that running a manor means knowing everything about everyone within its boundaries. Then Father Benedict's expression shifts to something more serious. There's also word from the north. The Scottish raids have intensified. Several manors near the border were burned last month. The bishop is calling for prayers and increased vigilance. The solar's temperature seems to drop again, though the fire burns as steadily as before. Scotland's raids on northern England are a constant threat in this period, part of the endless cycle of violence that marks the medieval borders. The lady's expression shows concern, but not surprise. This is the background reality of her life, the ever-present possibility that violence might sweep south and consume everything she's worked to build and maintain. We're far enough south to be safe, surely. Margaret's voice carries uncertainty, despite the question's confident phrasing. Father Benedict hesitates, and in that hesitation, you read volumes. Probably, yes, but prayer costs nothing, and caution is wisdom. It's a diplomatic non-answer that acknowledges danger without inciting panic, the kind of careful navigation between truth and reassurance that priests master early or fail their calling. The lady changes the subject firmly, asking about preparations for Advent. Father Benedict brightens, launching into discussion of the special masses planned, the music being rehearsed, the decorations for the chapel. This is safer territory, familiar rhythms of liturgical calendar providing structure and meaning to the year's turning. Margaret mentions the altar cloth her mother is creating, and Father Benedict expresses appropriate gratitude, examining the lady's work with the eye of someone who understands both the technical skill and the devotional significance. One of the servants coughs, a deep, wet sound that makes Father Benedict frown slightly. That cough sounds persistent, child. Come see me tomorrow and I'll prepare a syrup of horehound and honey. We can't have you ailing through Advent. The care in his voice is genuine, another reminder that medieval priests were often the closest thing to medical practitioners available to common people, their training including herbal remedies and basic diagnosis alongside theology. The gathering is beginning to wind down. You can sense it in the way people shift their weight, in the subtle relaxation of formal posture. Father Benedict gathers his portable altar items, returning them to the wooden box with careful reverence. The lady thanks him for his visit, and he bows. Not deeply, he's clergy, and therefore occupies an ambiguous social position that exempts him from full hierarchical performance, but enough to show respect. Before he leaves, he produces one more item from his cassock, a small vial of clear liquid. Blessed water from the cathedral well, he explains, handing it to the lady. For protection of the household, a few drops in each doorway, renewed monthly. Whether the water has any power beyond what faith grants it is unknowable, but the lady accepts it with genuine gratitude, understanding that symbolic protection can be as valuable as physical walls when facing uncertainties beyond human control. Father Benedict departs, taking the cold draught with him as the door closes, and the solar seems to exhale collectively. The sacred interlude has ended, returning the room to secular purposes, though the scent of pomanders lingers like a blessing made tangible. The door bursts open again before the room can fully settle back into its working rhythm, and this time it admits chaos in small human form. 3 children tumble in, 2 boys, perhaps 7 and 9 years old, and a girl who can't be more than 5, trailing a harassed-looking nurse who's clearly been outmaneuvered by her charges. The children make directly for the lady, their mother, with the homing instinct of creatures seeking warmth and affection before the night separates them until morning. "Mama!" the youngest shrieks with the piercing clarity that only small children achieve, launching herself at the lady's skirts with enough force that you're surprised the chair doesn't topple. The lady sets down her needlework with deliberate care. Those pearls are too precious to risk in the chaos of child greeting, and lifts the girl onto her lap, pressing a kiss to the top of her head where fine blonde hair escapes from a linen cap. "Catherine, darling, gentle, your mother is not a fortress to be stormed." But there's laughter in the lady's voice, real warmth that you haven't heard before in this room of careful status negotiations and measured words. The formal lady who manages households and mediates disputes vanishes, replaced by someone softer, more openly loving. The 2 boys approach with marginally more restraint, though the younger one is practically vibrating with barely contained energy. They bow. Someone has trained them in courtesy, though the execution is charmingly sloppy, and the lady beckons them close for embraces that they accept with the squirming reluctance of boys who are trying to be too old for maternal affection while still desperately wanting it. Margaret rises from her stool to make room, and the older boy immediately claims it, grinning at his sister with the triumphant superiority of someone who's won a prize. The younger boy settles cross-legged on the floor at his mother's feet, while Catherine remains firmly planted on the lady's lap, small fingers playing with the embroidery on her mother's sleeve. The nurse, a woman of perhaps 50 with the weathered face of someone who's raised multiple generations of children, hovers near the door, looking apologetic. "I'm sorry, my lady. I tried to settle them for the night, but they insisted on wishing you good evening first. Young Edmund especially was quite adamant." The older boy, Edmund apparently, looks proud of his adamance. "Father said we should always greet you properly before bed. It's courtesy." He's parroting adult words, you can tell, but taking genuine pride in following the instruction. Your father is correct, though he might not appreciate you using his own rules to circumvent Dame Agnes's authority. The lady's voice carries gentle reproof, but her eyes are dancing. She's enjoying this disruption despite the work it's costing her evening, and you realize these brief visits might be the highlight of her day. The moments when hierarchy relaxes and she's simply a mother with her children rather than a lady managing a complex household. Catherine has discovered the bowl of wafers still sitting on the side table and stretches toward it with the single-minded determination of a child who's identified something sweet. The lady intercepts the reaching hand. Manners first. May I please have a wafer, Mama? May I please have a wafer, Mama? Catherine parrots obediently and receives one as reward. She gnaws it with evident satisfaction, crumbs scattering across her mother's dress with the mess that small children generate effortlessly. The younger boy, you still haven't caught his name, asks Margaret if she'll play the lute, and she obliges with visible pleasure, launching into something bright and simple that sounds like a nursery tune. The children's faces light up with recognition, and even little Catherine starts swaying in rhythm on her mother's lap, the wafer temporarily forgotten in favor of music. Historians still argue whether medieval noble children spent more time with parents or nurses, whether the famous cold formality of aristocratic child rearing is historical reality or later invention. You're watching evidence for something more nuanced. These children clearly spent most of their time in the nursery with Dame Agnes, but they have regular access to their mother, enough that affection flows easily and naturally between them. Edmund begins telling a story about something that happened during his lessons. Apparently his tutor caught him drawing pictures of horses in the margins of his Latin grammar and delivered a lengthy lecture about the sanctity of learning that Edmund clearly found tedious. He mimics the tutor's pompous tone with surprising accuracy, making even the servants laugh, and the lady has to suppress her own amusement to deliver appropriate maternal guidance. Your tutor is right that you should respect your lessons, Edmund, but, and here she leans closer, lowering her voice conspiratorially, between us, I've seen your father's old grammar book, and it's full of drawings in the margins. Horses, hawks, even a rather good dragon. So perhaps the tradition is not entirely without precedent. Edmund looks delighted by this intelligence, filing it away as ammunition for future conflicts with the tutor. You're watching the lady perform a careful balancing act, supporting the tutor's authority while also acknowledging her son's humanity, maintaining discipline while offering understanding, preparing him for a life where he'll need to navigate similar contradictions constantly. The younger boy, you finally catch his name as Edmund addresses him as Robert, has discovered Eleanor's account books and is examining the wax tablet with fascination. Eleanor watches him carefully, clearly torn between wanting to preserve her work and not wanting to discourage a child's intellectual curiosity. What are all these marks? Robert asks, tracing the stylus scratches with one finger. Numbers, Eleanor explains patiently. Accounts of the household expenses, how much we spent on grain, on candles, on servants' wages, all the things that keep a manor running, must be counted and recorded. Robert's face shows the incomprehension of someone too young to grasp why counting things matters, but he nods seriously as if he understands perfectly. Edmund, older and sharper, perks up. Will I need to know accounts when I'm Lord? Father never mentioned that in the list of things I must learn. Your father has a steward to keep accounts, the lady says carefully, but a wise lord understands numbers well enough to know when his steward is honest and when he's being cheated. So yes, you'll need to learn, though perhaps not tonight. You notice how she's planted that seed, the idea that understanding household economics is masculine and important, not just women's work. Edmund processes this visibly, adding accounting to his mental catalogue of lordly skills, alongside riding and hawking and whatever else his father has emphasized. Catherine has finished her wafer and is now fighting sleep, her head drooping against her mother's chest with the weighted relaxation of a child succumbing to exhaustion. The lady strokes her daughter's hair with unconscious gentleness, and Margaret sets down the lute to approach with a blanket someone has thoughtfully provided. Shall we carry her to the nursery? Margaret asks softly, but the lady shakes her head. Let her rest a few minutes more. These moments are fleeting. She'll be too grown for my lap soon enough, and I want to hold her while I can. There's melancholy in those words, the acknowledgement that childhood is brief and her children are already slipping away toward the futures that await them. Edmund to lordship, Robert to the church, or knighthood depending on family needs. Catherine to marriage and the production of grandchildren who will continue the cycle. The boys are showing signs of similar exhaustion now, their earlier energy fading as the day's activities catch up with them. Edmund's eyes keep drifting closed, despite his obvious determination to stay awake and participate in the adult world a little longer. Robert has abandoned Eleanor's accounts and is leaning against his mother's chair, thumb creeping toward his mouth in a gesture he's probably been told he's too old for. Dame Agnes clears her throat softly from the doorway. My lady, if I might suggest, the children should be abed before they become overtired. It's phrased as suggestion, but functions as gentle insistence, the experienced nurse knowing exactly when the window for peaceful bedtime is about to close. The lady sighs but nods. You're right, of course. Come, darlings. Kisses for Mama, and then off to bed. She lifts Catherine carefully, the sleeping child murmuring protest but not waking, and transfers her to Dame Agnes's arms. Edmund and Robert receive kisses on the forehead and murmured blessings, then follow the nurse toward the door with dragging feet and backward glances. But at the threshold, Edmund turns back. Mama, will you come read to us tomorrow night from the Book of Saints? His voice carries the pleading note of a child who knows he's pushing boundaries but hopes affection will win out. If my duties permit, yes, now to bed, before Dame Agnes loses patience with all of us. The lady's tone is firm, but her expression is tender, and Edmund grins before scampering after his siblings. The door closes on the children's departure, and the solar seems suddenly larger, quieter, almost empty, despite all the women still occupying it. The lady returns to her pearl setting, but you notice her hands are slower now, less certain, as if the children's visit has reminded her of other things she'd rather be doing than embroidering altar cloths for demanding priests. Margaret picks up her lute again, but doesn't play, just holds it like a talisman against the melancholy that's crept into the room. Eleanor has returned to her accounts, but her stylus moves mechanically without real engagement. Even the servant seems subdued, as if the children's brief bright presence has made the evening's remainder feel diminished by comparison. You understand suddenly why these visits happen, not just so children can say goodnight to their mother, but so everyone in the solar can remember why all this work matters, why managing households and negotiating with stewards and creating sugar sculptures serves a purpose beyond itself. The children are the future these women are building toward, the reason all the careful planning and endless labor exists at all. The melancholy settles like dust after the children's departure, but the lady seems determined not to let it linger. She sets down her pearl setting one more time. You've lost count of how many times tonight, and rises from her chair with the kind of purposeful movement that announces a shift in the evening's program. Margaret, Eleanor, come with me. The rest of you may continue your work or rest as you prefer, but I need to make decisions about tomorrow's attire, and I want other eyes on the choices. This is clearly routine, rather than spontaneous. Margaret and Eleanor rise immediately, following the lady toward a door at the solar's far end that you hadn't paid much attention to earlier. It opens onto what must be the lady's private chamber, and you catch a glimpse of a large curtained bed, more tapestries, a chest that probably holds additional treasures before the door closes behind them. The servants remaining in the solar visibly relax the moment their betters depart. Postures soften, conversation rises in volume, the careful deference that marks every interaction when the lady is present evaporates like morning mist. Beatrice actually stretches, her spine cracking audibly, and one of the benchwomen laughs. Sitting straight for hours is harder work than most people realize. My back will ache tomorrow. You're witnessing the solar's transformation from formal workspace to something more casual, the version of this room that exists when hierarchy temporarily loosens its grip. One of the servants produces a leather flask from somewhere in her skirts and takes a swig before passing it to Beatrice, who drinks without hesitation. Whatever's in that flask isn't the fine Hippocras served earlier. It's probably rough ale or cheap wine, the kind of beverage that lubricates working-class sociability. Think the young lady will marry that squire the Lord's brother is bringing? Beatrice asks no one in particular, and immediately several voices offer opinions. The consensus seems to be that Margaret could do worse. The Welsh March's family is respectable. The boy is apparently healthy and not actively cruel, based on reports, and the match would strengthen useful alliances without requiring Margaret to move impossibly far from her family. Better than my marriage, one of the benchwomen says sourly. I got a widower twice my age with 3 existing children who resented me from the moment I arrived. At least Margaret will likely wed someone close to her own age, someone she can grow alongside, rather than trying to fit into a life already fully formed without her. The other benchwoman pats her companion's hand sympathetically. At least you outlived him and got your freedom back. That's worth something. It's dark comfort, the acknowledgement that widowhood, for all its economic precarity, at least offers women control over their own lives in ways that marriage rarely permits. The conversation meanders through the familiar territory of women discussing the institution that will define most of their lives, marriage as economic necessity, as social obligation, as potential source of companionship or misery, depending on luck and the characters involved. No one speaks of love, you notice. That's not what medieval marriage among any class is primarily about, though affection sometimes develops, and everyone seems to hope for at least tolerance and basic kindness. Inside the bedchamber, you imagine a different conversation happening. The lady, Margaret, and Eleanor are probably evaluating gowns and veils and jewelry with the strategic precision of generals planning a campaign, because that's what dressing is in this world, warfare by other means, each choice of color and fabric and ornament sending signals about status, taste, wealth, and allegiance that everyone literate in medieval semiotics can read instantly. The door opens sooner than expected, and Eleanor emerges alone, returning to her abandoned accounts with a slight smile. The lady wants the blue velvet tomorrow, she announces to no one in particular, with the silver embroidery and the good linen veil. She says if the steward is going to question her expenditures, she might as well look expensive while defending them. Appreciative laughter ripples through the solar. Your learnings that the lady wields appearance as a weapon, understanding that looking like someone whose judgment shouldn't be questioned makes it harder for stewards and other male authorities to dismiss her concerns. Medieval power for women often works through indirection, through making yourself impossible to ignore or contradict while technically maintaining proper deference. The lady and Margaret return minutes later, and you catch a glimpse of what they've been examining. Margaret is carrying an armful of fabric that shimmers, even in the solar's dim light. Silk, you realize, probably Italian or even Byzantine, dyed a deep crimson that speaks to expensive cochineal beetles crushed and boiled to produce that particular shade. The girl lays it carefully across the bench, and everyone leans in to examine it properly. For the Christmas festivities, the lady explains, I'm having a gown made for Margaret. She'll need something appropriate if we're entertaining visiting nobility. The seamstress will begin cutting tomorrow, which means we need to make final decisions about the design tonight. What follows is a consultation that feels almost democratic, with servants and nobles alike offering opinions about sleeve styles, neckline shapes, the placement of decorative trim. The lady listens to everyone, weighing the wool carder's opinion about how the fabric will drape just as seriously as Eleanor's suggestions about appropriate modesty for a young unmarried woman. It's a masterclass in collaborative decision-making that manages to feel inclusive while never actually threatening the lady's final authority. Historians still argue whether medieval women's fashion was imposed by male taste or represented genuine female aesthetic expression, and you're watching evidence for the latter. These women are deeply invested in the choices being made, bringing expertise and passion to questions about hem length and embroidery placement that might seem trivial but actually matter enormously in a world where appearance communicates status more reliably than words. Margaret is practically glowing with excitement, running her hands over the silk with reverent touches. Can we trim it with ermine? She asks, naming the white winter fur with black tail tips that marks the highest ranks of nobility. The lady hesitates, and you can see her calculating. Ermine is expensive and highly regulated, reserved for specific ranks, and claiming it inappropriately courts accusations of presumption. Fox would be more appropriate for your age and station, the lady says carefully, and it comes in beautiful colors. We could find a silver gray that would complement the crimson beautifully without suggesting pretensions above our actual rank. It's a gentle lesson in the politics of appearance, teaching Margaret that looking wealthy and looking presumptuous are separated by a very thin line that must be navigated with care. The discussion continues, covering details so minute they seem almost absurd. The width of the decorative bands at the sleeves, whether the neckline should be rounded or squared, how many buttons down the back, and whether they should be functional or purely ornamental. But you're beginning to understand that these conversations serve purposes beyond the ostensible task of designing a dress. They're creating shared investment in Margaret's future, building collective excitement about the Christmas festivities, giving everyone something to anticipate during the long, dark months ahead. One of the servants mentions that she heard the wool merchant's wife has a new gown trimmed with peacock feathers, and the entire Sola erupts in commentary about the appropriateness, or lack thereof, of a merchant's wife wearing such ostentatious decoration. The lady navigates this gossip carefully, neither condemning the merchant's wife too harshly. Merchants are economically important and shouldn't be needlessly offended, nor appearing to approve of what's clearly seen as social climbing through inappropriate display. Fashion is changing, Eleanor observes. The merchant classes are growing wealthier and want to show it. In another generation, the sumptuary laws may need revision to account for the new economic realities. She's talking about the regulations that legally restrict certain fabrics, colors, and ornaments to specific social classes, trying to freeze hierarchy in place through clothing restrictions that economic change constantly undermines. The crimson silk gets carefully folded and returned to the lady's chamber, protected from the fire's sparks and any accidental spills. The consultation has served its purpose. Decisions have been made, excitement has been generated, and the household has something concrete to work toward. In the weeks before Christmas, the seamstress will cut and sew, probably with assistance from several of the women in this room, and the gown will become a collective achievement rather than simply an individual possession. Margaret returns to her embroidery sampler, but her expression has transformed. Earlier she was grimly fulfilling obligation. Now she's practicing skills she knows she'll need when embellishing her new gown, adding personal touches that will make it distinctly hers rather than merely expensive. Motivation makes all the difference, and the lady has skillfully used the promise of the Christmas gown to reinvigorate her daughter's commitment to mastering necessary skills. The evening is advancing now. You can feel it in the way the fire is burning lower, in the increased frequency of yawns people try to suppress, in the general winding down of energy that marks late evening's transition toward night. But there's still work to be done, still conversations to finish, still the comfortable companionship of women gathered together against the darkness outside. Eleanor rises from her accounts again. The woman seems incapable of sitting still for long and approaches the lady with the kind of purposeful stride that announces important information incoming. She speaks quietly, but you're close enough to catch most of it. My lady, before the evening ends, we should discuss what we've learned today. The kitchen maid who went to market brought back some interesting intelligence. The lady's expression sharpens immediately. She sets down her pearl setting and gestures for Eleanor to continue, while also making a subtle hand motion that draws Margaret closer. The girl is being deliberately included in this, you realize, brought into the flow of information that keeps a medieval household functioning and thriving. This is education, though it looks nothing like Edmund's Latin grammar lessons. Eleanor settles herself on the edge of the lady's chair arm, an intimacy that speaks to their long association and mutual trust. The wool merchant from Flanders is definitely coming early this year. He's already in York and should reach us within a fortnight. He's apparently anxious to secure contracts before the Scottish situation worsens and disrupts trade routes. The lady's fingers drum thoughtfully against the chair's armrest. That's both opportunity and complication. We have quality wool to sell, but if he senses desperation in the market, he'll drive prices down. How many other estates in the region are in position to sell? 3, perhaps 4, with comparable quality. But the harvest was good this year, which means everyone has grain to sell as well. The market will be competitive. Eleanor's voice carries the satisfaction of someone who's done her research, who knows the economic landscape well enough to navigate it strategically. This is the conversation men would have in the Great Hall or the estate office, but it's happening here, in the solar, among women who are supposedly concerned only with domestic trivialities. You're watching the reality behind the medieval fiction that running a large household required the same economic acumen as any merchant venture, that women who managed estates needed to understand markets, trade routes, contract negotiations, and strategic timing just as much as their husbands did. Margaret asks a question that reveals she's been paying attention to more than just embroidery. If the Scottish raids are making merchants nervous, won't they be willing to pay premium prices for wool secured now, rather than risking delayed delivery later? Both the lady and Eleanor turn to look at the girl with expressions mixing surprise and approval. Exactly right, the lady says warmly, which means we position ourselves as offering security and reliability, not just quality wool. The merchant pays slightly more now to guarantee supply, rather than gambling on better prices later that might never materialize if violence disrupts transport. You're watching a masterclass in strategic thinking disguised as casual conversation. The lady is teaching her daughter to think several moves ahead, to understand how external events, Scottish raids in this case, create opportunities for those positioned to exploit them. It's the kind of education that will serve Margaret well, whether she marries a lord who values her input or one who doesn't, because understanding how economies work gives her leverage regardless of official authority. But Eleanor isn't finished. She glances around the solar, confirming that the servants are occupied with their own conversations, before leaning closer to the lady. There's also talk about the steward. Apparently he's been seen in the village tavern, more frequently than his duties should permit, and always in the company of the grain merchant's son. Given that we'll be selling grain soon, the connection seems noteworthy. The lady's expression doesn't change, but you sense something hardening beneath the surface, calm. Are you suggesting impropriety or merely poor judgment in associates? I'm suggesting we should ensure very careful records of the grain sale when it happens. Multiple witnesses, precise measurements, clear documentation of agreed prices. Whatever relationship exists between our steward and the grain merchant's son, we make it difficult for any misunderstandings to occur. Eleanor's delicacy with language is impressive. She's not directly accusing the steward of planning to cheat his employers, but she's making clear that the possibility exists and should be guarded against. Medieval estates ran on trusts, enforced by vigilance, you're learning. Stewards had enormous power to steal or make sweetheart deals with merchants in exchange for kickbacks, and the only defense was exactly what Eleanor is proposing: documentation so thorough that dishonesty became difficult to conceal. The lady, lacking legal authority to fire the steward herself, has to work through her husband, which means building an evidence trail strong enough to overcome masculine solidarity. I'll ensure your husband knows our concerns when he returns, the lady tells Eleanor, phrased in terms of wanting to maximize profits rather than accusing his chosen steward of potential corruption. Men respond better to appeals to their economic interests than to warnings about their judgment being flawed. It's cynical and accurate, and Margaret is absorbing every word, learning the subtle arts of influence that women must master when direct authority is denied them. You realize the solar functions as a kind of parallel government, gathering intelligence, analyzing threats, formulating responses, all without the official recognition or credit that male administrators receive for identical work. One of the servants calls out, asking about preparations for the washing that's scheduled for tomorrow. The lady shifts focus immediately, discussing which linens need priority, whether the weather will cooperate for drying, how many additional women should be hired from the village to handle the workload. It's mundane logistics, but it's also strategic planning. Clean linens are essential for the Christmas visitors, and failing to have adequate supplies would be a status-destroying embarrassment. Then Beatrice contributes her own piece of intelligence, clearly nervous about speaking up, but also unable to contain herself. "My lady, if I may, I heard from my cousin, who works in the next manor over that they've had trouble with poachers in their woods. 3 deer taken last month, and the gamekeeper thinks it's organized rather than random hunger." The room goes very quiet. Poaching is serious, not just theft of valuable resources, but a challenge to the Lord's authority over his lands. If it's happening at neighboring estates, it might spread here. The lady's expression shows she's immediately grasping the implications. "Thank you for telling me, Beatrice. That's exactly the kind of information I need to hear. Eleanor, make a note that we should suggest to my husband that the gamekeeper increase patrols and perhaps hire an additional man for the winter months. Frame it as protecting our investment. The venison for Christmas feasting is valuable, and prevention is cheaper than dealing with losses. You're watching information flow upward through social hierarchies that supposedly only allow communication downward. Beatrice heard from her cousin, felt empowered to share with the lady, and that intelligence will now inform estate management decisions that affect everyone. The solar functions as an intelligence network, gathering information through women's connections that cut across class and geographic boundaries in ways that male administrative structures don't access. The conversation splinters again into smaller exchanges, speculation about who might be organizing the poaching, hungry villagers driven by bad harvests, or professional criminals operating across multiple estates. Discussion of whether increased gamekeeper patrols will be enough or whether more serious intervention is needed. Debate about how to balance security against the expense of additional personnel. Margaret asks why poachers don't just accept the periodic distributions of meat that lords provide to their peasants and receives a brief education in medieval economics, that legal distributions are small and irregular, that hungry families can't wait for noble generosity, that poaching is often less about greed than simple survival. The girl's face shows the uncomfortable realization that the world is more complex than the simple moral categories her childhood education provided. Eleanor has returned to her wax tablet, making notes about all these issues that need addressing: the wool sale, the steward's surveillance, the gamekeeper situation, probably a dozen other things you've missed. Medieval estate management meant tracking hundreds of interconnected details, all of which could go catastrophically wrong if neglected. The lady's role requires the organizational skills of a modern CEO, combined with the diplomatic finesse of an ambassador, all exercised without official recognition or authority. We should also discuss the Advent alms, the lady says, and the conversation shifts to planning the charitable distributions expected during the Christmas season. How much grain can be spared for the poor? What about cloth for those who can't afford winter clothing? Should they distribute coins or goods, and in what proportions? Every decision involves balancing genuine charity against household needs, religious obligation against economic reality, the desire to help against the knowledge that resources are finite. The servants offer opinions based on knowing which village families are most desperate, which children lack adequate clothing, which elderly residents might not survive the winter without assistance. The lady listens carefully because this local knowledge is irreplaceable. She can't personally know every tenant and villager, so she relies on servants whose own families and friends form the population she's trying to help. Historians still argue whether medieval charity was genuine compassion or merely self-interested investment in social stability. And you're watching evidence that it's both simultaneously. The lady genuinely cares about preventing suffering, but she also understands that hungry, desperate people become dangerous people, that charity is cheaper than dealing with the consequences of letting poverty fester unchecked. The evening has become a strategy session, these women collectively managing an economic and social enterprise of staggering complexity. Tomorrow the men will think they're making decisions, but those decisions will be based on information gathered, analyzed, and packaged by the women in this solar, their labor invisible but absolutely essential. The strategic planning winds down as exhaustion begins to win its nightly battle against productivity. The lady returns once more to her pearl setting. but her movements have slowed, each stitch taking longer than the last as fatigue compounds. Eleanor's stylus hovers over her wax tablet without making marks, her eyes unfocused in the way that suggests she's stopped actually calculating and is merely going through motions. Even Margaret's lute playing has become desultory, random plucks rather than coherent melody, but the solar isn't quite ready to release its inhabitants into sleep. One of the benchwomen rises and crosses to a small cabinet you hadn't noticed tucked into the corner, its doors painted with faded images of herbs and flowers. She opens it to reveal shelves lined with pottery jars, glass vials, bundles of dried plants hanging from hooks, and the distinctive smell that wafts out tells you immediately what this is. The still rooms overflow remedies and preparations kept close at hand for immediate need. "My lady, shall I prepare the evening draughts?" the woman asks, and the lady nods gratefully. You watch as she selects specific containers with practiced certainty, mixing ingredients in a small mortar with efficient movements. A pinch of dried valerian root you think you recognize, known even in your distant future for its sedative properties. Something that looks like dried chamomile flowers, a scraping of what might be poppy seeds, though the dosage is so small you can't be certain. She adds honey to bind it all together and warm water to dissolve the mixture, creating a sweet-smelling tea that she pours into several small cups. The lady receives the first cup and drinks it without hesitation, trusting completely in the preparation. Margaret gets the second, Eleanor the third. The servants near the door receive weaker versions. They need to wake early for tomorrow's labors and can't afford the deep sleep that stronger doses might induce. You accept your own cup when offered and find it tastes surprisingly pleasant. The honey masking the bitter herbs underneath, warmth spreading through your chest and settling into your limbs with liquid comfort. This is medieval medicine in its most practical form, not the theoretical humoralism that university-trained physicians debate, but folk remedies passed mother to daughter through generations, refined by trial and error into preparations that genuinely help people sleep, ease pain, settle stomachs, and treat the 100 small ailments that make life uncomfortable. Historians still argue whether medieval herbal medicine was effective or merely placebo, but you're feeling the valerian's gentle sedative effect yourself, a softening at the edges of consciousness that makes sleep feel not just possible, but inevitable. The rose water is nearly depleted, the benchwoman reports as she returns the containers to the cabinet. We'll need to distill more before Christmas if we're to have enough for guests and our own use. The lady makes a mental note, adding it to the vast catalogue of tasks that require attention. Rosewater serves dozens of purposes: flavoring food, scenting linens, cleaning skin, mixing into medicines, demonstrating wealth through the casual deployment of expensive luxuries. Running out would be a minor disaster, the kind of detail that seems trivial until its absence causes cascading problems. Another servant asks about the supply of almond paste for making marchpane, and Eleanor confirms they have adequate stores, but should probably order more bitter almonds from the apothecary when he visits next week. The conversation has devolved into inventory management, the unglamorous reality underlying every beautiful sugar sculpture and perfumed cushion. Someone has to track supplies, anticipate needs, ensure materials arrive before they're desperately required. But threaded through the practical discussions is something else, a companionable drowsiness, the comfortable awareness of work well done and rest deserved. The herbal drafts are taking effect throughout the solar. You can see it in the way shoulders relax, in the increased frequency of yawns, in the general mellowing of mood and energy. Beatrice has abandoned her mending entirely and is simply sitting, hands idle in her lap, staring at the fire with the unfocused gaze of someone whose thoughts have drifted far from the present moment. One of the bench women has actually closed her eyes, though she's not quite asleep, hovering in that pleasant borderland between waking and dreaming. Even the wool carder has set aside her spindle. The day's quota apparently met. The evening's permission to rest finally accepted. The lady begins speaking, her voice soft and almost dreamy, about a memory from her own childhood. A winter spent at her father's estate when snow fell for 3 days straight, and they were trapped inside, the household transforming into a small self-contained world where normal rules bent under the pressure of enforced proximity and boredom. She describes building elaborate castles from cushions and blankets, performing plays for the adults, learning to play chess from an elderly knight who had nothing better to do than teach a curious child. Margaret listens with the fascination of someone discovering her mother had a life before becoming mother, that this dignified woman, managing households and negotiating with stewards, was once a girl who built pillow forts and pestered knights for entertainment. It's a gift the lady is offering, this glimpse of her younger self, and you watch Margaret receive it with visible wonder. Eleanor adds her own memory, the first time she made rose water, helping her mother feed rose petals into the still, watching the clear liquid drip out drop by precious drop, being allowed to keep the first vial for herself. I felt like an alchemist, she says with a smile, transforming flowers into liquid magic. I still have that vial, actually, though the water has long since evaporated, but the bottle reminds me of my mother every time I see it. The servants contribute their own stories, encouraged by the evening's unusual intimacy and the herbal drafts lowering normal social barriers. Tales of childhood Christmases, first loves, foolish mistakes that seemed catastrophic then but make amusing stories now. The solar fills with gentle laughter and the particular warmth that comes from shared vulnerability, from people allowing themselves to be human rather than merely functional in their assigned roles. You realize this might be the solar's true purpose, not just workspace or social venue, but sanctuary where women can briefly set down the burdens of their days and simply be together in companionable ease. The needlework and the music and the strategic planning are important, certainly, but this matters too, maybe more. The creation of community, the weaving of bonds that will sustain everyone through the long winter ahead and whatever hardships it brings. The lady's pearl setting lies abandoned on her lap now, the altar cloth draped across her knees, but receiving no attention. She's simply sitting, eyes half closed, listening to the stories flowing around her with a contentment that softens her face into something approaching peace. Tomorrow, she'll resume her endless negotiations with stewards and merchants and all the other challenges her position demands. But tonight, in this moment, She's allowed herself to rest. Margaret has leaned her head against her mother's shoulder, the lute forgotten beside her stool. The lady's hand comes up almost automatically to stroke her daughter's hair, and you're struck by the tenderness of the gesture. How much affection exists despite the formal training in hierarchy and deportment. How maternal love persists even in a world that often treats children as economic assets rather than individuals deserving devotion. The fire is burning very low now. Individual logs collapsed into glowing coals that provide more heat than light. Someone should add more wood, probably, but no one moves to do it. The dimness feels appropriate, matching the drowsy mood, the increasing pull towards sleep that even the most dutiful servant is finding hard to resist. One by one, conversations trail off into comfortable silence. The solar fills with the gentle sounds of evening's end, the fire's soft crackle, someone's quiet breathing, the wind outside testing shutters and whistling through gaps, the distant sound of the men's hall finally quieting as the last drinkers stagger toward their beds. You feel your own eyes growing heavy, the herbal draft pulling you down toward sleep with insistent gentleness. You try to resist, wanting to witness every moment of this remarkable evening, but your body has its own agenda, and sleep's gravity is becoming impossible to fight. The lady stirs first, rousing herself with visible effort from the drowsy cocoon the solar has become. "We should retire," she says softly, her voice carrying the regret of someone acknowledging necessity while wishing circumstances allowed otherwise. Tomorrow begins early, and tired minds make poor decisions. It's a signal that breaks whatever spell has held everyone suspended in this moment of collective rest. Bodies shift, groans emerge as stiff joints protest movement after long stillness. Hands reach for abandoned needlework and spindles and tools that need gathering before the night's final retreat. The solar transforms from sanctuary back into workspace, though the transformation feels reluctant, as if the room itself wishes they could all remain here in the fire's dying glow, rather than facing cold chambers and tomorrow's demanding reality. Eleanor begins the practical work of closing down the evening, gathering her account books and stylus, banking the fire so coals will survive until morning, checking that candles are properly extinguished rather than left to burn wastefully through the night. She moves with the efficiency of someone who's performed these tasks thousands of times, her hands knowing the work so well, her drowsy mind barely needs to supervise. The servants near the door are already standing, stretching muscles cramped from hours of sitting, collecting the tools of their various trades to return to proper storage. The wool carder carefully winds her remaining fibers into a basket. The spinner secures her spindle. Beatrice gathers the mending she never quite finished and tucks it into a cloth bag for tomorrow's continuation. Their movements are slow but purposeful, bodies operating on routine when energy has fled. Margaret rises from her position against her mother's shoulder, and you catch the imprint of fabric on her cheek where she's been pressed against the lady's gown. She's fighting sleep with determination, trying to maintain the dignity appropriate to her station even as her eyes keep drifting closed. The lady notices and smiles with maternal indulgence. "Go ahead to your chamber, daughter. I'll follow shortly." But Margaret shakes her head with Stubbs' insistence. I'll wait and walk with you, Mama. It's proper. The girl is performing courtesy even in exhaustion, demonstrating that her training has taken root so deeply it persists even when consciousness is barely maintained. The lady doesn't argue, recognizing both the futility and the value. Margaret is learning that being noble means upholding standards, especially when it's difficult, that privilege carries obligations that don't vanish merely because you're tired. One of the benchwomen approaches the lady with a small pottery jar. The salve for your hands, my lady. They'll stiffen overnight if you don't apply it after all that fine needlework. She's right. You've noticed the lady's fingers occasionally flexing as if sore, the price of hours spent manipulating tiny pearls and fine thread. The lady accepts the jar gratefully and begins working the salve into her hands, the scent of beeswax and lavender adding another layer to the Solar's complex olfactory landscape. Thank you, Agnes. I'd have forgotten and regretted it come morning. It's a small exchange, but it demonstrates the care that flows in multiple directions within this household, not just the lady caring for her dependents, but the dependents caring for her in turn, a mutual web of attention and support that makes the hierarchy more bearable for everyone trapped within it. The servants are gathering near the door, waiting for dismissal, but the lady seems reluctant to formally end the evening. She's holding on to these last moments, you sense, knowing that tomorrow the Solar will resume its daytime character, busier, more formal, less intimate, and this particular constellation of circumstances and mood won't recur exactly the same way ever again. Every evening is unique, every gathering slightly different, and perhaps she's learned to treasure the good ones while they last. Before you go, the lady says, addressing the servants directly, I want you to know that I see your work, I value your service, and I'm grateful for your loyalty to this household. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, but tonight has been pleasant, and you've all contributed to making it so. The servants look genuinely touched. Apparently, public acknowledgement of their worth is rare enough to register as remarkable. Beatrice blinks back what might be tears, and one of the bench women actually curtsies, a gesture of gratitude rather than mere obligation. You're watching leadership in a form that later centuries will struggle to understand, the lady maintaining absolute authority while also creating genuine affection and loyalty through small kindnesses and occasional recognition. Sleep well, all of you, and someone remind me tomorrow that we need to inventory the still room. I have a feeling we're lower on several supplies than we should be with Christmas approaching. Even in dismissal, the lady is planning, her mind already working on tomorrow's requirements, despite exhaustion pulling her toward unconsciousness. The servants file out, their footsteps fading down the corridor beyond the Solar's door. You hear muted voices, quiet laughter, the sounds of women heading toward whatever sleeping quarters they occupy, probably crowded chambers where multiple bodies share beds for warmth. Nothing like the relative luxury of the lady's private room. The class divide persists even in sleep, but you've seen enough tonight to know that the divide is more permeable, more complicated than simple oppression or simple harmony. Eleanor is the last to leave after the servants, pausing at the threshold to look back. The evening went well, my lady. Your daughter is learning quickly. Did you notice how she handled the question about the wool prices? She's thinking strategically already. The lady's face shows maternal pride mixed with something more complex. Satisfaction at Margaret's developing competence, but also perhaps sadness that childhood is ending, that the girl is being shaped into the woman she'll need to become, whether that's the woman she'd choose to be if choice were genuinely available. She is learning. Sometimes I wonder if we're teaching her wisdom or merely training her in survival skills. Perhaps wisdom is survival skills, Eleanor suggests gently. In this world, for women especially. Good night, my lady. Try to actually sleep rather than lying awake planning. I make no promises, the lady says with a tired smile, and Eleanor departs, pulling the door closed, but not latching it, leaving it slightly ajar in case the lady needs to call for assistance during the night. Now only you, the lady, and Margaret remain in the solar's dimming firelight. The room feels vast without its usual population, the shadows deeper, the silence more complete. The lady finally stands, moving slowly as if her body has stiffened from the long evening sitting. She picks up a candle from the table, lights it from the fire's coals, and gestures for Margaret to follow. Come, daughter. Tomorrow we'll begin preparations for your uncle's visit, and you'll need your wits about you. The next weeks will be chaotic. Margaret nods, collecting her own candle, the two flames casting dancing shadows as mother and daughter move toward the door that leads to their private chambers. At the threshold, the lady pauses and looks back at the solar one final time. You see her gaze sweep across the abandoned needlework, the empty chairs and stools, the dying fire that will be rebuilt tomorrow morning to begin the cycle again. Her expression is unreadable. Contentment, melancholy, satisfaction, weariness, all mixed together in the complicated emotional landscape that seems to define her existence. Then she turns away, and the door to the private chambers closes behind her and Margaret, leaving you alone in the solar with only the fire's last glowing embers for company. The room settles into deeper quiet, the kind of silence that feels almost sacred after so many hours of voices and activity. You can still smell the lingering scents: beeswax, lavender, rose water, the herbal drafts, the sweet ghost of hippocras and wafers. You realize you've witnessed something rare, not history's grand events that dominate chronicles and textbooks, but the intimate reality of daily life in a medieval manor house. The texture of ordinary evening that repeats endlessly with small variations across the years and seasons. This is what most of life actually consists of for most people in most eras: work and rest, conversation and solitude, small pleasures and persistent responsibilities, all woven together into the fabric of existence that seems unremarkable while you're living it, but becomes precious in memory. You remain in the solar as its final visitor, the only witness to the room's transformation from living space back into empty chamber, waiting for tomorrow's inhabitants to claim it again. The fire has collapsed entirely now into a bed of crimson coals that pulse gently with residual heat, each breath of air through the chimney making them brighten and fade like a heartbeat, visible in embers. The candles have all been extinguished except the one you hold, its small flame creating a bubble of golden light that barely reaches the walls, leaving most of the room in comfortable darkness. You rise slowly from your cushion, feeling your own body's protests after hours of sitting in medieval discomfort. Your feet have gone slightly numb, pins and needles awakening as circulation returns, and you have new appreciation for how these women maintained grace and poise despite physical conditions that would have modern people complaining within minutes. The floor rushes crunch softly under your weight as you move toward the window, drawn by curiosity about what the night looks like from this vantage point. The glass is cold against your hand when you touch it, the November chill seeping through despite the thickness. Beyond the panes, darkness is nearly absolute. No street lights, no electric glow, nothing but the faint suggestion of starlight filtered through England's perpetual cloud cover. You can barely make out the shapes of buildings in the courtyard below, the bulk of the great hall, the outline of walls that separate the manor from the wider world. A dog barks somewhere in the distance, the sound carrying clearly through the still night air, and you hear the muffled response of another dog closer by. This is what night meant before humanity tamed it with artificial light, a profound darkness that transformed familiar landscapes into mysterious territory that made the 10 feet between buildings feel like dangerous journeys that turned night into a fundamentally different world from day. You understand suddenly why people gathered in rooms like this solar, why the fire's light and human company mattered so intensely, why the evening devotions asked God's protection through the darkness. Night was genuinely dangerous, practically and psychologically, and these rituals of light and gathering served purposes beyond mere sociability. You turn back to the solar's interior, letting your eyes adjust to see what the room reveals about itself when empty of people. The tapestries on the walls show their age more clearly without candlelight to flatter them. You can see where colors have faded, where threads have loosened, where previous repairs have been made with slightly mismatched materials. They're still beautiful, still valuable, but they're also clearly loved and used rather than merely displayed, objects that serve daily purposes rather than existing as pure decoration. The lady's chair sits empty, but still emanates authority somehow, its carved arms and crimson cushion marking it as special even when unoccupied. You resist the urge to sit in it. Some boundaries of respect persist, even when no one's watching to enforce them. Instead, you trail your fingers along its back, feeling the smooth wood worn slightly concave, where generations of hands have touched this exact spot, connecting you briefly to all the women who've occupied this chair before tonight's lady, stretching back through time to the manor's founding and forward to women you'll never meet. The embroidery the lady was working on still rests on the small table beside her chair, and you lean close to examine it properly. The pearls she set catch your candlelight and throw it back multiplied, each one a tiny planet with its own luminous atmosphere. The stitching is extraordinary, absolutely even, the threads invisible except where they're meant to show, creating texture and dimension through technique you lack vocabulary to properly describe. This altar cloth represents hundreds of hours of labor, skill refined through decades of practice, devotion expressed through patient excellence. When it finally graces the church altar at Easter, most people will admire it briefly and move on, never knowing or appreciating the human cost of its creation. Margaret's abandoned sampler lies on her stool, and you examine her work with more sympathy now that you've spent an evening watching her struggle with it. Her stitches are improving. You can actually see progression from the earlier attempts to the more recent work, the growing confidence and control. The section she unpicked and redid at her mother's instruction is noticeably better than the first attempt, justifying the lady's strict standards, even if they felt harsh in the moment. You wonder what kind of woman Margaret will become, whether she'll find happiness in the life being prepared for her, whether the skills she's learning tonight will serve her well, or feel like beautiful chains binding her to expectations she never chose. Eleanor's account books rest neatly stacked on her chair, and while you wouldn't dream of reading them, some privacy boundaries persist even in historical voyeurism. You appreciate them as artifacts of female competence that medieval record keeping rarely acknowledges. These accounts represent real work, genuine expertise, economic management that keeps the entire household functioning. Yet if they survive to your distant future, they'll probably be attributed to male stewards or dismissed as trivial domestic record keeping rather than the serious administrative work they actually are. You drift toward the corner cabinet that holds the stillroom supplies, drawn by curiosity about its contents. Opening it carefully, the hinges creak slightly in the silence. You find exactly what you expected, but also more than you imagined. Dozens of jars and vials, each carefully labeled in handwriting that's probably the lady's or Eleanor's, containing substances ranging from familiar herbs you recognize to mysterious powders and tinctures, whose purposes you can only guess. This is a pharmacy, a perfumery, a medicine chest, and a kitchen all compressed into one small cabinet, representing knowledge accumulated and refined across generations of women, teaching each other what works and what doesn't. You select one jar at random, carefully, respectfully, and examine the label. For melancholy, it reads, "Poppy and honey, 2 spoonfuls in warm wine." Another claims to help with difficult childbirth. Another promises to ease joint pain. Another guarantees sweeter breath. Whether they work is almost beside the point. They represent the attempt to exert control over bodies and circumstances that often felt beyond control, the refusal to accept suffering as inevitable even when it probably was. You return the jar to its shelf with the care due precious things and close the cabinet gently. The sugar sculptures still sit hidden beneath their linen cloth, and you carefully lift one corner to peek at them again. They're even more beautiful in solitude when you can examine them without worrying about propriety or take in someone else's viewing time. The castle's tiny details, the swan's impossible grace, the geometric knot's mathematical perfection, all of it represents human skill pushed to its limits, the transformation of base materials into art through knowledge and patience, and sheer, stubborn determination to create beauty in a world that often feels hostile to it. You notice things about the solar that escaped your attention during the evening's activity, the uneven floorboards that create slight valleys where centuries of feet have worn paths between door and fireplace, door and window, door and the lady's chair. The smoke stains on the ceiling beams where countless fires have sent their exhalations upward. The scratches on the windowsill where someone, many someones, probably, across many years, has idly traced patterns while gazing out at weather and seasons, and the unchanging view of manor walls, this room has absorbed so much life, you realize? So many evenings like tonight, so many conversations and confidences and strategies and songs. So many women have sat where you sat, worked where you worked, felt the fire's warmth and the November cold and the complex mixture of satisfaction and exhaustion that comes from a day fully lived. The solar holds all of it somehow. These memories soaked into wood and stone and fabric like water into thirsty ground. You find yourself yawning. The herbal draft's effects haven't fully worn off, and your own exhaustion is becoming impossible to ignore. Your candle has burned halfway down, the wax pooling around the wick, and you realize you should probably follow everyone else's example and seek whatever bed has been prepared for you, but you're reluctant to leave, knowing that stepping through that door means ending this remarkable evening, returning to whatever comes next, losing this particular moment that can never be exactly recreated. So you allow yourself a few more minutes, settling back onto your floor cushion one last time, watching the coals breathe their red glow, letting the solar's particular peace wash over you. The darkness outside presses against the windows, but doesn't enter. The room maintains its character as sanctuary, as safe harbor, as the space where women carved out small territories of autonomy and competence and mutual support within a world that often seemed designed to deny them all three. You think about the lady, probably in her bed now, perhaps still awake despite exhaustion, her mind running through tomorrow's tasks and next week's preparations and the 1,000 details that require her attention. You think about Margaret, learning to be the woman her world demands, while possibly wondering about the woman she might have chosen to be. You think about Eleanor and the servants and all the women whose labor tonight made everything function smoothly, whose names won't appear in chronicles, but whose work made those chronicles possible by keeping the men fed and clothed and housed. The fire's last coals are fading now, their light dimming toward darkness, and you know it's truly time to go. You rise one final time, collect your candle, and move toward the door with slow reluctance. At the threshold, you pause and look back, trying to memorize the solar's details, the tapestries and cushions, the abandoned needlework and quiet corners, the whole intimate geography of this room that's revealed so much about how medieval women actually lived when the great events of history weren't watching. Then you step through the doorway into the corridor beyond, pulling the door closed behind you with a soft click that sounds almost like a sigh. The solar settles into its nighttime silence, waiting patiently for morning light and the return of voices and activity. But for now, in the deep quiet hours, it rests, and you carry with you the gift of having witnessed what really happened here. Not the grand dramas or political intrigues, but the ordinary, extraordinary evening when women gathered after supper to work and talk, and simply be together in the gentle glow of firelight and companionship. You make your way slowly through the darkened corridor, your single candle creating a small moving circle of light that barely touches the stone walls on either side. Each step feels heavier than the last, the day's long witness settling into your bones with pleasant weight. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the manor house breathing, the creak of old timbers adjusting to nighttime temperatures, the whisper of wind finding gaps in shutters, the profound silence of a world gone to sleep. Your own chamber, when you finally reach it, is small but adequate. The bed piled with wool blankets and furs that promise warmth against November's chill. You set the candle on a small table and begin the slow process of preparing for sleep, your movements automatic, your mind still dwelling in the solar with its gentle firelight and the women's quiet voices. The herbs from earlier are pulling you down now, insistent and kind, making your eyelids heavy and your thoughts soft around the edges. As you finally slip between the blankets, you realize you've been given something rare tonight. Not just information about how medieval people lived, but genuine glimpse into the texture of their days, the small moments that made up lives just as rich and complex as your own, despite the centuries between you. The Solar's evening has reminded you that history isn't just dates and battles and kings, but also pearls being set one by one into linen, and children asking for wafers, and women sharing intelligence that keeps households functioning. Sleep is coming now, gentle and inevitable as tide. Your last conscious thought is gratitude for the fire's warmth, for the stories shared, for the privilege of witnessing what really happened in the ladies' solar after supper, when the men were occupied elsewhere and women created their own small commonwealth of work and rest and fleeting beauty in the long November darkness. Sweet dreams.